Hello everyone, I know you are watching this video to accompany your sleep. So, if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also don't forget to tell me where you are from, and what time you watched this video. So this happened when I was around 9 years old. I'm 25 now, and it's something I will never forget. It still gives me goosebumps to this day. I live in a terraced house, which for those of you who don't know is 4 houses combined, and my neighbors and I each have our own little patio. There's a small road 10 meters from my yard where people do their Sunday walks, and so on. Only a small fence separates my small yard and patio from that road. I live in a pretty crowded area with several of these terraced houses spread around in my neighborhood, so seeing people walking on that road is pretty normal for me. Seeing random people standing on my patio is not. When I was 9, I usually got home from school about an hour before my mom got home from work. I live maybe 50 meters away from school, so my mom figured I was mature enough to be home alone for around an hour before she got home. This particular day I got home from school. I did the usual thing, which was to make sure I locked the front door and double-checked that the back door leading to the patio was also locked. I was 9, so being alone was a little scary, even though it was in the middle of the day, and only for about an hour. I then rushed to my room upstairs to play as much PlayStation as possible before my mom came home and made me do my homework. While playing, I heard this noise coming from outside my window. My room was located 1 floor over the patio with a view to the road I told you about earlier. It was kind of like the sound of a cat, but my cat had been missing for over 3 months. Hope sparked my mind, and I thought, oh my God, did he finally come back? I ran downstairs to check if it was my cat, but the sight that met me gives me goosebumps just writing this. There was a guy standing on my patio. A tall guy with black hair, covering half of his eyes, making him look like a male version of the Ring woman or something. I could hear him making high-pitched sounds almost like a cat meowing. The brown liquid was running down from his mouth, and I could see him spitting out my dad's stomped cigarettes. He was actually eating from the ashtray. I was frozen observing this. Eventually I snapped out of it and screamed so loud that the man must have heard it. He didn't react. He just kept on eating from the ashtray. I ran upstairs to my room, locked the door, and called my mom, who then called the cops. I've never been more terrified in my life. Laying in bed under my sheets, shivering with fear as I hear those creepy high-pitched noises from the guy eating cigarette stumps from the ashtray on my patio. I kind of blacked out for a moment, because the next thing I remember is the police arriving on the road by my yard. I hear them talking to the guy, saying stuff like, "What are you doing? Get over here, or we'll come arrest you," and so on. He didn't respond, but the high-pitched sounds were more frequent and louder. I decided to look through the window, feeling safe now that the cops were here. I could see 2 police officers standing by my fence, 1 man and 1 woman. I didn't see the creepy man, however, because he was standing directly 1 story under me in my field of view. The police jumped the fence, and I remember hearing the creepy guy screaming louder than anything I've ever heard before. He charged the female officer with full force, and he fucking knocked her out cold. The male officer then immediately tossed the guy, leaving him shaking on the ground, screaming still. The policeman struggled to keep him on the ground while putting handcuffs on him, but eventually made it. After a while he managed to wake up the female police officer, who seemed to be badly hurt. He called for backup in an ambulance, and then he sees me standing in the window above him. The expression on my face must have been something else, because he just looked at me and said, "I sure as hell hope you didn't see all of that." I started to cry. By this time neighbors started to arrive, wondering what the hell was going on. One of my neighbors, an elderly woman, made me come down, and she took care of me until my mom came back home. The police took the creepy guy with them in the car and left. Before they left, they promised me to come back and talk to us about what had happened. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The male police officer came back later that night and sat down with me and my mom to talk. He explained that the guy on the patio was actually diagnosed with severe autism. He had escaped a facility where mentally challenged people lived, located around 5 kilometers from where I live. He explained that the guy had actually been living in my house 5 years ago, but he had been forced to move when his mom, his only caretaker, died. The poor guy probably thought he would find his mom in my house. He missed the routines, and he missed living there with his mom. The police had to move him from the house that time 5 years ago because he was extremely strong. From what I heard, he had extreme tensions in the body because of the autism, making his muscles grow stronger and stronger throughout the years. This was the reason he reacted the way he did when the police came that day. Still frightened, I told the police officer that he needed to make sure this would never happen again. He promised it wouldn't. After a few sleepless nights, my life got back to normal. The years went by, and the guy didn't ever come back until 1 year ago. At this time, my mom and dad had moved out. I bought the house from them, and I'm still living there today. I was enjoying my morning coffee on the patio when I see this random guy stopping on the road by my fence. He just stands there looking at me. I look at him and give him a nod, and then I hear the high-pitched noises. Holy shit, it's him. His hair had turned gray, but the high-pitched sounds had made me recognize him. My heart started racing, and I instantly remembered the reason why he was back. I realized that he must have managed to escape again. Because I kept my cool a bit longer than when I was 9, I started to realize how sorry I felt for the guy. 16 years later, and he was back to look for his mom. I decided to carefully ask him if he wanted to come down to the patio. He instantly jumped the fence. I started to think that he would knock me out like he did to that police officer, but he didn't. He smiled. He looked at me and smiled. I offered him to sit down, but he didn't respond. I offered him to come inside, and he started laughing. We went inside, and his face lit up. Pure joy. He was home. It reminded him of the life he had with his mom. It almost made me tear up. All of a sudden, he sat down on my couch, turned on my TV, and switched directly to the cartoons. I observed him for a while. He was just completely focused on the cartoons. I just wanted him to enjoy the moment, so I didn't say anything to him. I realized I had to call the facility to let them know. The caretakers arrived 10 minutes later. After a lot of convincing, he got back up crying, and they went back to the facility. I called the facility 2 days later. We made a deal. His name is Tom, and I now consider Tom my friend. Every Sunday from the day he returned, Tom and his caretakers visit me to watch cartoons. They say it's the highlight of his week. It honestly makes my heart warm. Now for several years my thoughts were let's not meet guy on my patio eating from the ashtray, but now my thoughts are let's meet every Sunday to watch cartoons, my friend Tom. One time I went to the bar with one of my friends. I had just turned 21, so I haven't been to many bars up to that point. My friend was drinking on the way to the bar, so he was already pretty drunk when we got there. When I sat at the bar, a cute girl came and talked to me and my friend. She said her name was Candace, and I noticed she had a really bright red hair. I assumed she dyed it. I mean, it was pretty but unnatural. Anyways, the girl was flirting with me and my friend. She could tell my friend was already very drunk. To be honest, I played along like I was drunk already too, since it seemed to be working for my friend. I didn't know if she was just trying to get free drinks, so I told her we didn't have much money. She then offered to buy us drinks. She kept buying us drinks, and I started to get confused as to who she liked between me and my friend. My friend went to the bathroom. Before he came back, he was kicked out by the bouncers. He was way too drunk. Candace and I went outside with him. She kept telling him to go home with her. He was so out of it he could barely answer her. I told her he was too drunk and that I couldn't let him go anywhere. I didn't want him to wake up hungover in some random house with no car and idea what happened. Candace kept pushing it, saying that she would take good care of him, but I told her no because I had to stay with him. I was more sober than him, and he was my responsibility. I told her the only way he was going anywhere was if I tagged along. I assumed she thought I was jealous or cock-blocking, but my friend could barely stand and lost interest in Candace already at that point. She immediately started flirting with me and offered to get my friend a taxi to drive home and said we could go to her place alone. At this point I had a few drinks and I was already buzzed, so I agreed. We took my friend to the taxi and walked to her car. I slightly stumbled on the way to her car. "Why, you're pretty drunk, huh?" she said, smiling as she held onto my arm. "Yeah," I said. I don't know why, but I just felt slightly shy and anxious. Everything was just happening too easy for me, so I felt uneasy. We got in her car and we drove down the street. "Want to stop at the liquor store and get somewhere to drink? I'll buy it, so don't worry about paying," she offered. I didn't want to drink any more than I already did. I mean, I was already buzzed and wanted to be able to carry myself throughout the rest of the night. Sometimes I made myself look stupid when I'm drunk, so I didn't want to ruin anything with Candace more than I already did earlier with telling her my friend was too drunk. I told her I was already drunk enough, but she insisted. I didn't want to seem lame, so I told her to get me a pint of liquor with some apple juice to chase it. She went into the store and came out with a lot more than just a pint. I assumed she wanted to drink more also, and that's why she got a fifth instead of a pint. On the car ride we passed the bottle back and forth, but she took tiny sips. I tried to take tiny sips, but she kept passing me the bottle and telling me to drink. I somehow managed to drink all of my apple juice, and I pretend to drink the bottle by spitting the liquor into the apple juice bottle. I tossed the apple juice bottle full of liquor out the window before she even saw it. I didn't want her to know that I was acting drunker than I was. I mean, she actually believed I was sloppy drunk when I was simply buzzed. I took a couple more sips of liquor and then finished the bottle. Throughout the car ride, I called her the wrong name a couple of times to get a reaction out of her. She didn't react to it. She just kept letting me call her Carla without correcting me. For some reason, I thought maybe she lied to me about her name initially. We drove up to her house, and I pretended to trip and stumble into her front door. She helped me walk inside by holding me up. She opened her front door, which was unlocked, and we walked into her house. She closed her front door, and then she locked it. I thought that was strange, but assumed she didn't want anyone walking in on us. I told her that I had to use the bathroom. I walked into her bathroom, locked the door, and looked in the mirror. I just felt strange. I felt like something was off. I felt myself becoming more drunk from finishing the bottle earlier. I turned on the sink to make noise and made myself puke up the liquor I drank. I flushed, went to the sink, and started drinking the tap water out of my hands to sober up. I just didn't want to be drunk, but I still wanted to hook up with Candace, so I pretended to be drunk. I turned off the sink, and I could hear her talking to someone. Who was she talking to and do what? I walked out of the bathroom and into the living room. The moment I stepped into the living room, I saw her walking into another room. All I could see was the back of her head, that strange, very bright red hair go into another room. I didn't see her face or anything. I just saw her kind of walk fast into the room. The living room was pretty dark. "Hey, where are you going?" I slurred like I was drunk. She walked back into the dark living room and up to me. "Let's go in my room," she said. I looked at her bright red hair and then into her eyes. They were different. Her whole face was different. It was another girl with the same hair. And that's when I realized it was another girl with the same wig on. It was a wig the whole time. She changed it with the girl from earlier for whatever reason. My heart felt like it stopped, but I tried to look like I had no idea it was a different girl. I kind of smiled at her and told her I needed to use the bathroom one more time and told her sorry I was so drunk. She said, "It's fine. Just hurry up in there." I went into the bathroom and locked the door. I heard her whisper something to someone again. This time I think I heard a male voice whisper back. I honestly didn't concentrate on listening to exactly what she said, but something sketchy was going on, and I had to get out of that house. I opened the bathroom window and jumped straight out of it and ran faster than I ever have in my entire life. I didn't look behind myself or anything. I just ran straight through the backyard, jumped the fence, ran through someone else's backyard, hit a road and ran towards the main road. I kept running down the main road until I saw a Star CVS. I ran into the CVS and stood straight at the front of the store in front of the camera. I called a taxi and went home. I tried to think of what happened that night. What was she or they planning that night? Why did she tell me a fake name? Why was she trying to get my friend, and I so drunk? I thought maybe a robbery, but she kept spending money on us. She kept buying us drinks and even paid for my friend's taxi cab. And mostly, why did she wear a wig that she gave to another girl to wear? Who was she talking to? What did it mean? And what was in that room they tried to lure me into? The next day after this incident, I went back to the house with a couple of friends to see just what was going on. Nobody was there. No cars, no people, nothing. Just an empty house. I ended up finding out that the house was a summer rental, and whoever those people were, they broke into the house and used it for only that night and never came back. Anyways, that's my story. So last night I was at a classmate's house working on a group project we have due tomorrow. I live in an apartment in the town where our university is located, and my classmate lives at his parents' house, which is in the foothills just outside of town. In order to get to the house, you have to drive along a relatively secluded and narrow two-lane road for about 5 to 6 miles. We started working on the project at about 6 p.m., and I ended up hanging around for a while after we had finished our work. So I left his house pretty late at about 11 and started down the road back towards town. I didn't realize how tough it would be to navigate the roads at night. There were no street lights and the road was unkempt and riddled with potholes, and on top of this I had no cell service, so I had to drive very slowly to make sure I didn't blow out one of my tires since I had used my spare one a couple of weeks back. I figure I was about 3 miles from the house when I rounded a tight corner and saw a pickup truck with a camper shell parked diagonally across the road. The manner in which it was parked completely impeded my path, and I couldn't drive around it because there was a gully on both sides of the road. The only way for me to go at this point was backward, where there was a pull-off I could use to turn my car around. At first I couldn't see inside the cab, but when I turned on my high beams I saw that there was a man slouched over in the driver's seat, his head resting against the steering wheel as if he had been knocked out after a bad accident. I immediately sensed that something was wrong. The way his car had just coincidentally come to rest in a position that totally blocked the road was a big red flag for me. I had heard stories of people playing dead in the road as a way to lure unsuspecting people out of their cars so that they could rob them. I decided fuck this shit and elected to go back to my classmate's house and explain what was going on. I threw the car into reverse and kept darting my eyes back and forth between my rear view and the truck. I looked and saw that I was almost to the pull-off where I could turn around. When I looked back, my heart skipped about 5 beats. The man who had been slouched over in the driver's seat was now walking at my car in a hurried pace, while a few other men jumped out of the camper shell and started moving towards me as well. I panicked and accelerated backwards into the pull-off, which messed up the undercarriage of my car pretty bad. As I put it into drive, the guy was already at my passenger side door, tugging on the handle, which thank the Lord was locked. I only caught a brief glimpse of him, but his face appeared to be scabbed and leathery, definitely a meth head or some sort of drug abuser. I sped away and didn't slow down at all until I reached the house, constantly checking my rear view to see if they were following. Thankfully they didn't tell me, and when I reached the house I explained what had happened to my classmate and we called the cops. I was so grateful that my buddy's parents were kind enough to let me stay the night. They didn't find anyone on the road matching the description, but I filed an incident report and they told me that they would be on the lookout for similar vehicles and suspicious activity, but holy shit, I'm still so shook up over it. I keep getting the same adrenaline rush I got when I saw the guy charging me whenever I think about it. I was 21, recently became a police officer, and was also recently dumped, so my friend suggested Tinder. As a 21-year-old and new cop, I had the I'm invincible, and I can take on anyone mentality. I matched with a very good looking out of my league female. We chatted and eventually set up a date to meet. She said she had a great open field to look at stars and hang out, and that we could meet up at her house. So the night came. I was excited, and she seemed to be excited when I picked her up. She guided me to the field, and it looked nice. Open space, woods, deer, and other wildlife. In the field I noticed really dim headlights in the distance. Then the van started driving towards us, and pulled up right in front of us, almost close enough to block me from going forward. I told her to stay in the car, and I'll go say hi. I grabbed my flashlight I had in the car and walked up. In the front driver's side of the van, there was a decently sized man. I asked him what was going on, and if he could back up his car a little bit. He was very polite, said he was the owner of the property, and said he didn't mean to scare us. He told me he's been having trouble with poachers on his property, and just wanted to make sure we weren't going to be shooting at anything. I assured him we only came out to look at some stars and wildlife. He was perfectly okay with that, told me to have a nice date, and drove away. After that, the girl was texting nonstop. Around an hour later, I saw headlights coming towards us again, this time at a really fast pace. We hopped in the car, and I moved it to a more defensive position. The same man came close enough to almost hit my car. She hopped out of the car at that point and ran towards the guy. I immediately knew I was fucked. I got out and gave them commands to back up and get on the ground. Neither of them complied, obviously. He then proceeded to charge me and knock me on the ground. Luckily, I was able to get him on his back and get up. I saw my date grab a metal pipe from the van. She told me they had a gun and to give them my money in the truck and that I won't get hurt. Of course, with my I'm invincible mentality, I said no. She started to cry and was saying they didn't want to hurt me. He then started to go back towards the car. At that point, I told them I was a cop, drew my concealed firearm, and told them to lay on the ground. After a moment of shock from all of us, they complied. I was able to call 911, tell them my name and badge number, that I had 2 at gunpoint and needed backup immediately. I gave our dispatcher the best directions I could to this field. While I was on the phone, they both fled. Again, stupid new cop young guy mentality. I chased them. I took off after the man, who ran into the woods around the field. I chased him for maybe 30 seconds, and I heard 3 loud pops and saw muzzle flash. My I'm invincible mentality went right out the window. I ran like hell back towards my car and peeled the hell out of there. I went back to the area, I picked her up and called dispatch again and had officers come to that location. Of course, the first officers to pull up was my sergeant and my field training officer. Of course, they were both completely understanding and didn't give me any shit about it at all. The most used words were dumbass and stupid fucking rookie. I hopped in their car and went towards the field. Luckily, the van was still there. I was told to shut my mouth and only come out if they started getting shot at. They cleared the area and started looking in the van. They found meth right on the center console and searched the car. What scared me the most was when my field training officer and sergeant came back to the patrol car. They let me out and told me to come look in the back of the van. Both of them were pale, looked horrified. I went to the back of the van where there were several knives, duct tape, lighter fluid, a decent amount of rifle ammunition, handcuffs, and what looked to be dried blood. In the front passenger seat side, we found an AR-15 style rifle and 2 more handguns. We called for immediate backup and detectives. When they investigated the blood, it turned out it wasn't blood. The plates had been stolen, and the van was a reported stolen. I still get shit about the whole encounter, but luckily no one got hurt. I will never use online dating again. Ever. I was about 7 years old, my brother about 10. It was well past our bedtime when our mom woke up off the couch to put us to bed. Our dad worked construction out of town back, and so it was often just us 3 at the house for weeks at a time. Up the stairs and to our immediate right was our parents' bedroom. Going left put you in the middle of a hallway. Taking another left down, that hallway led to my brother's room. The opposite end was my room, which was also across the hall from our upstairs bathroom. At either end of the hallway, our windowed doors we always kept locked and rarely used. The door on my end led to a balcony overlooking our front yard, and the door to my brother's end opened to our back porch. The house kind of leans into a small hill. My brother and mom both had a bad habit of waking up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. I only knew this because I was always a light sleeper, and they just couldn't help flushing with the door wide open. This night, however, my brother stopped on his way to his room and came back towards the bathroom. He then said, "I'm going to try to pee before I go to bed." The past few nights I've been too afraid to walk to the bathroom. I keep seeing a man wearing stripes at the end of the hallway. I don't know if my mom wrote it off as my brother telling ghost stories to try to scare me, or if she was already half asleep and didn't catch it, but she didn't react at all to my brother's confession. I, on the other hand, was terrified by it. The fear of seeing a ghost like that at the end of the hallway, or through the windows, is the reason I started running from the stairs to my bedroom at night. Years later, when I was about 18, my mom and I were having a conversation in her car about a dog we had for a very short time when I was little. We were sharing stories about Max's tendencies towards destroying my shoes and other unruly behaviors when my mom blurted out, "Do you remember that time I opened the front door for the cops and Max ran inside to the kitchen and started tearing open that big bag of dog food we had?" This really caught me by surprise because in all the years I lived in that house we never once called the cops. I mean, we were a gun-owning family in a quiet rural West Virginia neighborhood. I asked her what she was talking about, and she looked equally surprised, as if she had just revealed something by accident. "Oh, that's right, I never told you, because you were too young at the time. One night I woke up hearing noises outside my window, and when I looked I saw a man staring into my bedroom." She went on to describe how turning on the lights caused him to take off running, and how she grabbed my dad's pistol before calling the cops. I can't remember all the details they gave them when they showed up. Tall white male wearing a striped shirt and jeans, short dark hair, something like that. They said it matched the description of a man they were looking for in the area, and it turns out he had escaped from jail on a murder charge. Now I know it sounds obvious hearing those 2 stories back to back, but it wasn't until a few years ago in my mid-20s that I pieced together that my brother had unknowingly warned us about a murderer who spent multiple nights casing our home. I've always had an innate fear of not so much the dark, but the night itself. As a child, my imagination was overcome with stories of creatures that come alive at night in the safety offered by a house and light. I never had anything to base this fear on, until a night when I decided to go with a buddy of mine to a baseball game and got stuck at a light at 2 a.m. after dropping him off at home. Of course, that night, the game went into extra innings, and so I didn't get a chance to drop my friend off back home until well after 1 a.m. Everything was fine on the way home until I hit a light right before the street that led to my house. It was a T-junction, and I was turning left. The light is one of those that you think is broken until it finally turns green, right when you finally decide to just run it. So of course, I pulled up right as the light turned red. I would have just run the light, seeing as no one was there, and it was closing in on 2 a.m. on a school night. But earlier that week, I had heard the phrase, "Character is what you do when no one is looking," and for whatever reason, that was the night I decided to prove to myself that I was a man of character. Big mistake. I pulled to a stop at the light, feeling good about myself, bordering on self-righteous, when I happened to look out of my window to my left and noticed a lady sitting all alone on a bus bench. We made brief eye contact, and I quickly looked away. It was too late. I could see movement out of my peripheral vision and knew she was coming my way. I looked out the window and noticed she was carrying a bag. I quickly checked that my doors were locked and that all my windows were up. I then moved my right foot above the accelerator, just in case, and braced myself for what was to come. I was hoping it would just be an awkward exchange, and was praying for a quick light change before she reached me, so I could just get out of there. But I knew there was a slim chance of that. She walked right up to my window, put down her bag, and began to tap on my window. I nervously looked up at her, and she mentioned for me to put my window down. I had automatic windows, so I just imagined pushing too hard on the window button, and that thing just coming all the way down. So I took a deep breath and lightly flicked it with my finger. The window moved microscopically down, but she didn't seem to notice or care. She then leaned in and began to talk. She said, "My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride?" I should stop and give you a brief physical description of the bag lady. She was small and skinny, and kind of an indeterminate age. She was either in her mid-20s and had lived a hard 20-plus years on the street, or she was 60-something years old, who had lived a moderately hard life on the street. All that to say, just by looking at her there was no way to verify her story. She looked beat up by life, not just by a boyfriend. But there was something about her delivery. It was robotic and seemed practiced, like she was disconnected for the moment. That made my skin crawl. And after a brief, maybe about a second debate on whether I should do it, I told her that I had to get home and that I couldn't give her a ride. After my first refusal, she leaned in closer and said the same thing again. "My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride?" This time I felt more confident when I declined to give her a ride and told her I had a curfew and had to get home. She leaned in a third time and began her statement again. "My boyfriend beat me up." At this point, the light changed and I slowly lifted my foot off the brake and started slowly rolling forward and began muttering an apology. She didn't move. She just looked at the light, looked down at me, leaned in closer, and said 5 words that have haunted me ever since. "You made the right decision." Then she picked up her bag and walked back towards the bench. I peeled out of the intersection and cried and screamed all the way home. I have no idea what she planned to do, or if there were more people waiting to jump in my car from the bushes had I moved to let her in. But that encounter has haunted me ever since, and has confirmed in my mind that nothing good happens after dark. During my early 20s, I worked as a meter reader in Iowa City, Iowa. A meter reader is the person who records how much electricity, gas, or water you've used each month. If your meters are on the inside and you want an accurate bill, a meter reader must enter your home, whether you're there to let them in or not. Just to clarify, we only entered homes if consent was given when the customer first signed up for service. Customers also provided us with keys if necessary. Entering a home when the owner wasn't there is something that I never got used to. No matter how loudly I knocked, I never shook the uneasy feeling that I wasn't welcome. The inside of a home is the ultimate private space. A home's exterior is just the image of ourselves that we project to the rest of the world. But the further you venture inside, the closer you come to truly seeing what kind of person lives there. And if you want the raw, unfiltered truth, head for the basement. I really hate basements. I've seen walls that look like giant, static-filled TV screens, only until I realized it was roaches scurrying across a white background. Cobwebs so thick and dusty that it looked like the cotton candy machine exploded at the Spider County Fair. I've seen rats, snakes, feces, weapons, neglected children, abused pets, homeless squatters, massive hordes, bizarre sexual items, a makeshift meth lab, and even a coffin. There are usually rational explanations for all of these things. Well, maybe not the coffin, but there was one basement where what I found was beyond the grasp of logic, and that's what made it so terrifying. It was an old apartment house. From the outside, it looked like every other house on the block. I entered the back door and found myself at the staircase. I ran my hand along the wall until it grazed a light switch. I flipped the switch, but no lights turned on. I wasn't carrying a flashlight. A typical route involved 5 or 6 hours of walking, so I carried as little as possible. Oftentimes, I used the light from my handheld screen, but it only illuminated whatever was about a foot in front of it. So, armed with the world's worst lantern, I made my way down into the darkness. Once at the bottom, I blindly shuffled across the room, one baby step at a time. With my arms outstretched and head down, I eventually reached the far side of the basement. I shined the dim light from my handheld along the wall and discovered 2 doors. Each door led into its own small room. I chose the door on the right, and I found the meter in the far corner. As I entered the reeds, I began hearing noises coming from the other room. Something was moving, and there was whimpering that grew louder the longer I listened. I eventually realized that it was a dog. It sounded weak and distressed. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. At this point, the dog was scratching the other side of the door. I felt helpless. I reported it when I got back to the office, but I couldn't shake the thought of that dog. It stuck with me over the next month, until it was time to return. So there I was 1 month later, back within that basement. At least this time, I knew where the meters were located. I shuffled back to the little room on the right, while keeping my ears open for any sounds coming from the other room. This time I heard nothing. I read the meters and started making my way back, but I couldn't shake the memory of that dog. Was it still trapped inside that room? My curiosity got the best of me. I stood outside the door for a few moments, listening. Still nothing. That's when I made a huge mistake. I tried to open the door. I had no more than jiggled the doorknob when I first heard it. Screams. Blood-curdling screams unlike anything I'd ever heard. Sounds that I didn't think a human was even capable of producing. Short, piercing, high-pitched shrieks followed abruptly by a low, drawn-out, guttural moan that ultimately formed into something that I can only describe as crying, but much louder. It was all over the place, like some sort of psychotic, free-form jazz. I stumbled backwards, nearly losing my balance. I shouted something like, "Hello? Who's in there?" There was no response, just screams. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Still no response, just screams. There was no doubt that I yelled loud enough for him to hear me. He didn't want my help, he wanted me gone. I fumbled my way through the darkened room toward the exit. When I reached the top of the stairs, I just stood there listening. I was trying to wrap my mind around what I was hearing. I waited for the screaming to stop, but it never did. When I finally left, it was still as loud and demented as when it began. I felt relieved, but that quickly vanished when I realized I had to do it all over again next month. I reported what I'd heard, but nothing came of it. As my return drew nearer, a sense of dread grew inside of me. What kind of lunatic sits alone in total darkness and silence? My mind created endless explanations for what kind of hell laid beyond that door. By the time I returned, I'd built him up so much in my mind that anyone other than the devil himself would have been a letdown. But there was no sign of him the next month, or even the next several months. I'd nearly given up on solving the mystery when a stroke of luck pulled me back in. One night, I went to a concert with my friend Laura. After the show, I gave her a ride home. She'd moved somewhat recently, so she had to give me directions. I didn't pay much attention to where she was leading me, until she pointed to a house a little bit up the street. I couldn't believe it. She had moved into the house with a mysterious room in the basement. I said to her, "Look, this sounds weird, but have you noticed anything odd about the basement at this?" But before I could finish my sentence, she blurted out that there was a crazy guy who lives down there. Finally, I had confirmation. She went on to tell me that even though her apartment was in the attic, she often heard him yelling late at night, but that wasn't all. She had actually met him. One day, while walking to her car, she saw him standing in the lawn. He stood perfectly still, with no expression on his face. He was directly in her path, so she cautiously made her way around him. She noticed he was staring at her, so she offered a friendly hi as she passed. He had no reaction, except for one unsettling exception. He stuck out his tongue, then quickly sucked it back into his mouth and resumed acting like a statue. Thoroughly creeped out, she got into her car and drove away. 2 or 3 months later, I finally met him myself. I entered the back door like I had done so many months before. This time, something was different. There was a light on in the basement. I peered down the staircase. At the bottom, a ragged-looking dog was staring back at me. It was the same dog I'd heard during my first visit. Then I noticed something else. Behind the dog, I could see a pair of bare feet. The ceiling blocked my view of the rest of whoever was standing there, but it didn't matter. I knew it was him. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I know this probably doesn't make any sense, but at this point, my desire to finally get some answers outweighed my fear. I shakily called out, "Hey, I'm the meter reader," and started to make my descent. As I made my way down, more of him was revealed. He looked to be middle-aged, his head was shaved, and his eyes were wild. He was wearing pants, but no shirt. What I remember most was how lean and sinewy his body looked. It had a look of a body that was never at rest. I explained who I was and what I was doing there. To my surprise, not only did he talk to me, but he actually sounded somewhat normal. The volume and pitch of his voice was odd, but he said the same sorts of things that people typically said to meter readers. I even started to doubt whether or not he was the same man I'd heard screaming, but soon enough, his behavior slowly removed all doubt. As I read the meters, he rapidly paced back and forth. He was constantly wringing his hands together and spastically cocking his head from side to side. The longer he talked, the more agitated he became. He began grimacing, and little verbal tics started popping up in his speech. Every so often, he'd blurt out a loud noise in the middle of a sentence. He was trying to suppress these sounds, but he was losing the battle. I started to make my way to the exit, and he followed. His verbal outbursts grew louder and more frequent. I was petrified. When I reached the stairs, I drew our conversation to an end and said goodbye. As I turned to head up the staircase, he could no longer hold it in. Screams. The very same unforgettable screams that I'd heard coming from the locked room. I ran up the stairs as fast as my legs could carry me, flung the door open, and rushed back into the daylight. A month or two later, I had a couple friends, including Laura, over to my place. I was excited to tell her all about my encounter, but as I was relaying what happened, I could tell that something else was on her mind. When I finished telling my story, she told me something that she'd seen a couple weeks earlier. One day, she noticed lights flashing outside of her window. She looked outside just in time to see police officers placing the man from the basement in the back seat of a squad car. She later found out from another tenant that he had attacked someone with a knife. That was the last we ever saw of him. I don't know what became of the man in the basement. I'd like to think that he got the help that he needed, but maybe that's just because I'd rather not think about the alternative. This is something that happened to me about 2 years ago, but thinking about it still gives me chills. I used to live in a small town in rural Missouri with my mother and stepfather. Our house was a few miles outside of town and along an old state highway. We were pretty isolated out there, other than the occasional passing car or farm equipment. One day, I came home from a morning shift at work. I was pretty tired, so I immediately came in the front door and sprawled out on the couch. My mother and stepfather were preparing to go into town to visit a family friend, so I just started a movie and quickly drifted off to sleep. I remember waking up to the sound of my parents leaving, but after that I slept rather soundly. I must have been asleep for a couple of hours before I was woken up to the sound of my front door opening and closing. I laid silently, hoping to fall back asleep. I assumed it was just my parents returning from their visit. After a moment of silence, I heard an unfamiliar voice say, "Where is everybody?" My eyes shot open, and I looked up to see a man standing over me. I have never seen this man before. He was tall and muscular, and he was wearing a white t-shirt with cut-off sleeves. He was also covered head to toe in blood. I jumped to my feet instantly. I had never been so scared in my life. Trying to rationalize, I asked, "Are you looking for my parents?" He stared at me for a moment and asked who I was. I replied by asking, "Who are you and what the fuck are you doing in my house?" He stared at me blankly. I thought I was going to be murdered. He kept talking incoherently and asking where everyone was. At this point, I had no idea who he was referring to. After about 5 minutes of nearly crippling fear, I realized that the blood that was all over his clothes and his face was his own. I glanced out the living room window toward the highway, and then I started to understand. In the drainage ditch in front of my house was a red pickup truck. I told the man to come with me, and we went outside. Soon after we got near the truck, another vehicle pulled up. Apparently the man had been drunk driving and had driven his truck into the ditch. He was drunk and had a concussion from the wreck. He was so messed up that he thought that other people were in the truck with him before the wreck, when in fact he had been alone. He had stumbled into the nearest house looking for help. The driver that had just pulled up drove the man to the hospital, and as far as I know he was okay. Though I understand the situation now, I will never forget this. It was fucking terrifying. A week or so before my 10th birthday, I walked to the corner store with a $5 bill and picked up a jar of ragu for my mom. On my way home, a man I'd never seen before fell in step with me and began talking. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "My name is Dr. Ramsey. I'm a pediatrician. Do you know what a pediatrician is?" I walked along silently, not replying and fervently hoping he would take that as a sign that he should leave me alone. Subtleties were not his strong suit, though, because he kept right on chattering. "Are your parents looking for a pediatrician for you? Of course, you're almost a big girl now. You'll be needing another kind of doctor soon, won't you? That's okay, though. They can still bring you to me until then. What's your name?" You have beautiful hair. I was just on my way to get some suckers for the candy jar in my office. Do you like suckers? Thankfully, we were nearing my house, so I ran forward up the back steps and in through the kitchen door. I didn't know it then, but that was just the beginning of a very long, very scary ordeal. It didn't take long after that for Dr. Ramsey to begin showing up. At first it seemed benign enough, at least to a kid. He would drive by nearly every day smiling and waving. I told my mom, who said maybe it was just on his way home from work, but then the phone calls began. My dad called me into the living room and sat me down. He asked about the day that Dr. Ramsey followed me home and if I talked to him. He said that I wasn't in trouble, but that I needed to tell him the truth. I told him no, and he asked if I was sure or if I could be forgetting something. I told him no again, and he frowned and then asked, "Then how does he know your name?" I didn't know. It turns out that wasn't all he knew. He knew my sister's name as well. Pretty soon neither my sister or I were allowed to answer the phone. He called several times a day. At first neither of us knew what he was saying. Then one night one of my brothers told us that he was telling my parents that he was going to hurt me and later my sister. Things got complicated after that. My dad called the police, but as this was before there were any stalking laws, there wasn't a lot that they could do. They told my parents to call back if he, quote, tried anything. My dad then called a friend of his from back in the day who happened to be a cop. For the next month my dad's friend escorted me to and from school. Suddenly life, as I knew it, came screeching to a halt. I couldn't walk to school alone. I couldn't play outside. I couldn't walk to Super America, which is sort of like a 7-Eleven for those of you who don't know. When access to me was completely denied, things escalated. It was around this time he began threatening my sister as well. Then one afternoon my sister, two of my brothers, my mom and I were in the kitchen. One of my brothers saw a glimpse of someone in the garage. They'd seen him too. Dr. Ramsey came bolting out of the garage, my brothers chasing after him. They ran all the way to Cherokee Park, where he lost them in the trees. My parents called the police again, but nothing came of it. The only information they had was a description and a name that was almost certainly fake. A couple weeks later we woke to find our dog hanging from the side porch. She was a gorgeous saddled-back German Shepherd born the same day I was. We were all devastated. The cops said that there was no evidence it was him and ruled it accidental, but none of us believed that. His phone calls became more informative in the meantime. He would talk about who was home and who wasn't. If my brother would say my dad was home, he would tell him who was really in the house. He would also talk about the house itself. About the window in the kitchen he could easily open with a knife from the outside, even when it was locked. And about the French doors that connected the living room to the side porch, and how the lock could be finagled from the outside if you jiggled it just right. That night my dad put in some carpenter nails at the bottom of the French doors until he could get a new lock ordered. My parents had to go to a company event for my dad's work. My older brothers were at St. West roller skating rink. My sister was on the phone with her best friend. My little brother was on the floor asleep, and I was watching Devo on the midnight special with Wolfman Jack, and it was really late. Suddenly the top of the French doors swung inward, and in the few milliseconds before the nails on the bottom caused them to snap back, I could see his silhouette. My sister whipped the phone at the television, and we ran up the stairs. About halfway up we realized our little brother was still asleep on the living room floor. As quietly as we could we slipped back down the stairs to get him. We all went into our bedroom and didn't turn on the light, this way we could see outside. We watched out the window for a while, and when we didn't find him we crept down the hall to our brother's room to look. We looked down and could see someone standing at the back door. He knocked loudly. "What do you want?" My sister asked out the window. He stepped back. "And is this the Mercy residence? I have a pizza for delivery. Can you come to the door?" She scoffed at him, declaring she was not stupid. She could see he didn't have a pizza, and she was calling the cops. He left. A short while later my brothers returned home. We told them what happened, and they walked around the yard looking for him. They came back in and things settled down. By now we'd pretty much given up on calling the cops because it never helped. So we just went back in, each of us except my youngest brother still asleep carrying a knife from the kitchen, just in case. Eventually one of my brothers went into the kitchen to get a bowl of cereal. You know that sensation you get when you can just feel someone watching you? Yeah, he had that in spades. He kept looking around the kitchen through the doorway into the dining room at the windows. He didn't see anything, but he could still feel eyes on him, so he went closer to the door to try and see better. The kitchen lights were reflecting on the windows of the door, as it had 3 rows of 3 windows, so he still couldn't see. He stepped closer then closer again, until he was right up to the door, then cupped his hands on either side of his head so he could see. There on the other side of the window pane was Dr. Ramsey smiling back at him. He turned to yell for my older brothers, but when he looked back again he was gone. They went out again to look for him, but they didn't see him. The next night we were at the table playing crazy eights, and my brother was restless. My sister asked him what was wrong, and he said he always felt like any minute now there would be a loud noise on a door or window. Almost immediately after he finished his sentence, boom on the window right behind him. In the chaos the two eldest ran out, but he was already gone. A couple weeks later I was at school, and we were outside on the playground during recess. I was swinging upside down when I saw that now familiar blue Ford Galaxy cruising by, moving slowly. There he was, smiling and waving. He called my name, and I ran to the teacher and told her. The school had been told all about him, and she took me inside right away and called my mom. That same day my mom had gotten a call from the school office asking her to verify that my dad was picking me up, as he called to say he was on his way. He wasn't. Not long after that I woke up one night thirsty. I went down to the kitchen for a drink, and there sitting alone in the dark was my dad. On the table a gun. He was tired of the police waiting until Dr. Ramsey tried something. He was tired of his children being terrorized. He was tired of being afraid every time he left for work that something would happen to us while he was gone. I sat with him for some time watching before he sent me back to bed. These events and many more took place over a period of around 18 months. Then as suddenly as it began, it was over. He had vanished from our lives. The phone calls, the drive-by with the creepy waves, everything. For a long time during and after the Dr. Ramsey days, I would have a recurring nightmare in which I would wake up to find him standing over me as I slept. It took a long time before I felt like a kid again. I found out years later that when he was calling, Dr. Ramsey would tell my parents that he was going to rape and kill me and later my sister, and that there was nothing that they could do about it. I don't know what happened to him when he disappeared. I don't know if he was in a car wreck, locked in prison, in a coma, but sometimes I wonder if the wait ended for my dad when he was sitting in the darkened kitchen one night. I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to. About a year ago, in my final semester in college, I worked at a department store in the mall. I didn't have a car yet, so I asked for day shifts because it was a 2-hour bus ride back home. So basically if I had a closing shift I'd get it done at 11, but not get home until 1 a.m. But sometimes I'd be given closing shifts, much to my annoyance, since I had a 6:45 a.m. class, and my mother's worried, because who wants their kid on public transport that late? I mean, sometimes she could come and get me, but it'd be too much of a hassle to get my younger sisters out that late, and such, so I never asked her. My managers being the jerks that they gave me a week of closing shifts, knowing my situation. I was pissed, but whatever. One night I had just finished my shift, got on the bus, sat in the back, and was minding my business when my iPod died. I was annoyed, but I just kept my earbuds in and occupied myself by playing a crossword on my phone. About 2 seats behind me I hear these guys speaking Spanish. Now my stepmother is Puerto Rican, so while I understand a fair bit of Spanish, I don't speak it. So I hear them talking, but I don't pay attention because it's rude to eavesdrop and all. That was until they say that black girl up there. Then my ears perk up. I keep my earbuds in so that they think I can't hear them, and I continue listening. What they're saying is horrific. To paraphrase, they knew my stop, which was the second to last one before the bus gets back to the terminal, and while my stop is at the front of my neighborhood, it's got no street lights, and at this time of night it's empty. And to put it simply, they were planning on, quote, snatching that piece of ass up. I was about 20 minutes away from home, so I knew I had to act quickly. Since I knew they could see me as they were 2 seats behind me, but like a cross, if that makes any sense, I pretended to play on my phone, acting oblivious, while I was actually texting my mom. I text her saying, "Mom, can you please meet me at the bus stop?" 5 minutes go by, but no answer. We're getting closer to my stop, so I decide to call her cell phone. No answer. I call the house phone, and she finally answers. It's about 12:30 a.m., so she was sleeping. I try to talk as calm and cheerily as I can. This was our conversation. "Hey Mom, did you get my text?" "I know, what's up?" "Oh, I sent you a picture of these jeans I'm gonna order online when I get some. I really need your opinion, so I really needed to go look since the sale ends at 1 a.m. She gets the hint that I need her to look at her cell phone, so I say goodbye and hope for the best. We get to my stop, and thank God I see my mom's car. I pick my shit up and hightail it off the bus. I don't even look behind me to see if they're following me. I jump in the car and tell my mom to just go. I look in the rear view, and I see the guys just staring at the car. The next morning I called my job and told them I quit. No more public transport for me. Thanks to my stepmom for teaching me Spanish, and thanks to my mom for getting the hint. I hope I never see those creepy, weird Spanish-speaking guys again. A few years back, my girlfriend and I, having hiked several other parts of the Appalachian Trail, decided we wanted to give the southern portion of Virginia's trail a shot. It's about 166 miles long and runs through George Washington and Jefferson National Forest from Roanoke County to Pearlsburg in Giles County. This is definitely one of the more remote and less traveled parts of the trail, which is exactly what we were looking for. We gathered our gear and made our way to the start of the Virginia Creeper Trail to begin our journey. We had planned our journey to end at Damascus and figured that by the time we got there we would be more than ready to get home to our own beds. It was early October, and the changing of the leaves and colors were amazing. The air was crisp and cool. It was pretty much perfect hiking weather with beautiful scenery. The majority of the trip was pretty uneventful, just your typical hike. But our last couple of nights is where things got weird. On this portion of the trail, you're supposed to camp on the trail or a designated shelter. We didn't really want to run into any other people and didn't want anyone coming up on us in the middle of the night. So we decided to ignore those suggestions and find our own little spot off the trail. A little searching around, and we found a spot a little ways off the trail in the middle of a small clearing. It was perfect. We set up camp, cooked some food, talked for a while, then snuggled up and went to sleep for the night. Somewhere around 2 a.m. I was awoken by my girlfriend shaking me awake and telling me. She informed me that she woke up to what sounded like someone right outside of the tent running a knife or something along the side while circling us. When hiking, I carry a 1911 and a judge with me. After all, you never know exactly who or what you might run into when on such a long hike in a remote location. I got the judge out of my pack, and then we sat silently listening for any sounds. A few minutes of nothing but the breeze blowing through the trees, and then I heard it, snapping and crunching noises. Someone or something walking in the woods behind our tent. I got the flashlight and silently made my way out of the tent. Our fire had went out, so it was nearly pitch black, illuminated by only the dim glow of the October moon. I told my girlfriend to stay put while I checked it out. I didn't flick the flashlight on right away, so as not to give away that I was out of the tent and have it become a shining beacon of my location. Instead, I waited to hear more noises. After a few minutes, I heard another snap, crunching and cracking. It sounded like it was bipedal based on the way the steps were paced. I turned on the flashlight and flooded the area with light. I thought I saw someone move behind a tree. I yelled out and told them to go away and that I was armed. I kept the light on the area with my gun drawn and slowly approached towards the area where I thought I saw the figure. Then from my right I hear what sounds like someone running away through the woods. I spin and face my light that way, and then from the original spot here, who or whatever it was there, take off into the woods. There's no way I'm giving chase, so I return to the campsite. I tell my girlfriend about what happened, and I end up sitting guard outside the tent in the darkness until daybreak. In the morning I looked around a bit for signs of who or whatever it was, and I discovered a boot print in some soft moist dirt not far from our tent. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't my girl's. This really freaked me out, as it confirmed that someone, perhaps more than one, was skulking around our tent in the dark. I kept it to myself because I didn't want to freak my girl out any more than she already was. At this point we were pretty deep in and still had 2 days left. That day we walked a little faster than normal and covered as much ground as possible. When it came time to set up camp, I found a spot near a cliff where we could place the tent in a small overhang and prevent anyone from coming up behind us. The whole day up to this point, I had a feeling we were being followed. I had no confirmation of this, as I hadn't seen or heard anyone else, but it was just a gut feeling. We set up camp and made some food, and then retreated to the tent. I gave my girl the 1911, and I kept the judge right next to me, and I assured her that if I slept at all it would be with one eye open. After a while she drifted off to sleep, and I stayed awake listening to the sounds of the woods at night. I was awake for a few hours just waiting to see if anything was going to happen. At some point I guess my exhaustion caught up with me, and I drifted off. I awoke sometime later to what sounded like someone going through our stuff outside the tent. I grabbed my gun and woke my girlfriend, shushing her to be quiet. From the faint glow of the fire I could see someone's silhouette against the tent. There really was someone out there. I yelled out to them something along the lines of, "We are armed, get the fuck out of here." They dropped what they were doing and bolted. I came out of the tent, gun drawn, and ready to shoot someone. Our stuff was strewn all about. They had rummaged through quite a bit of our stuff. I walked to the edge of the woods in the direction whoever was out there had fled. There was a creek nearby, and I walked to the edge where there was a small trail running alongside it. Down the creek I could see a light. It looked like a lantern the way it flickered. Then I saw 3 more emerge from the other side of the woods. I told my girlfriend to start packing up whatever she could, and that we were leaving now. We packed up everything of value, left the tent and a few other items, and headed back onto the trail in the middle of the night. I kept hearing people talking off in the woods and hearing branches snap for quite some ways. I kept looking behind us every few seconds to make sure nobody was coming up on us. It was completely nerve-wracking. If something happened, we were still a long ways from anywhere, and quite literally on our own, since we hadn't seen another hiker the entire time we'd been out there. I really felt we were in serious danger. We had been walking for quite some time when I heard something in the woods behind us. As we rounded a corner, I turned around and saw someone step out onto the trail and just stand there watching us. It was just as the sun was coming up and there was barely any light, so I couldn't make out any features. It was just the silhouette. I stopped and looked at them for a second, asked them who they were and what they wanted. They just stood there silently watching us and then turned and walked back into the woods. We picked up the pace and kept going, looking back every so often. We didn't see them again, but my gut told me that they were still there for quite a ways. We eventually reached the end of the trail and got to where we had parked my girlfriend's car, extremely exhausted. We made it out of the Virginia woods without becoming a meal for a clan of cannibalistic inbred hillbillies, which is what I pictured happening in my head the whole time. I have no idea who they were or what they wanted. Maybe it was just someone messing with us, or maybe it really was a clan of deformed hillbillies who were hunting us. I'll never know because I will not be returning to find out. Around 2 years ago, I finally moved into a brand new house and a brand new building estate in Australia. I was one of the first to have a finished build in the area and was elated to finally gain independence. The first few weeks went by as normal, and during that time I'd often take walks alone with the dog in the afternoons and roam the surrounding estate area. All the roads around us had been partially completed and all the other properties were marked out, but no other houses were built excluding the one that was directly opposite of mine. The house looked finished, but there was no driveway laid yet, and from what I could gather no one lived there. To the left of my house, roughly a few hundred meters away, was a field with a huge hill on it. I later found out that the whole area was council property. Not only was no one allowed to build up there, but the whole hill was basically a no-go zone. For whatever reason the council just didn't want people on it, so the whole area was surrounded by a huge chain-link fence. The only other noticeable feature in the area was a small abandoned farmhouse with a shed a few kilometers down the road. I knew nothing about it and often went walking there with the dog as it gave me something mild to explore amongst the vast nothingness I was living around. The entire place was dilapidated and completely inhabitable, but it was still interesting nonetheless. About a month or 2 after moving in, I awoke one morning to the sound of a violin. It sounded extremely distant and quite haunting. I actually enjoyed it and assumed that the opposite me had finally moved in. Excited that I finally had some people to talk to, I peeked out the curtain and saw that the house opposite mine was still as vacant as it ever was. I got dressed, but by the time I managed to look outside, the violin had stopped. This happened roughly every second day for the next week. The violin would wake me up and then just disappear after about 45 seconds. I'd ignored it to the point where my curiosity simply got the better of me, and the next morning when I heard the violin playing again, I immediately jumped out of bed, threw on my dressing gown and shot out the front door. I scoured the early morning surrounding, and there up on the hill was a figure playing a violin. It was barely light, but the person looked very tall from the distance I was at, and as they were playing they were doing what only could be described as a waltz-type walk, spinning slowly around in a circle as they played. I took my eyes off the person and walked over to pick up the morning paper, and in the 10 seconds that took me I heard the violin stop. When I looked up I noticed the figure was no longer playing or dancing, but was now standing still and most likely looking in my direction. It was so dark I couldn't make out, and we both just stood there for half a minute, not moving before they got the better of me, and I went back inside. After that morning things started happening. On my walks I began to notice footprints on the surrounding properties that weren't made by me and that I'd never seen before, which I just assumed were from people walking up from the other housing areas down the road. I never awoke to the violin, but I swore I could hear someone walking down the street next to my bedroom window in the early mornings. However, I never saw anything. Other really general things as well, like random tools such as spades and rakes laying around the area which I guessed were left there by construction crews, none of which I ever saw. I'd start getting calls at work that would immediately hang up on me, and I also stopped walking up to the abandoned farmhouse as the experience with the violin player had me a little shaken. One night as I was heading to bed, I turned off the television in the living room and again could hear the faint sound of a violin playing. However, it sounded more muffled and rehearsed. I froze and a cold chill flowed through me instantaneously, considering that it was about midnight and not the usual time I'd hear it playing. I went to the front window and peeked out to see that there was a light in the house opposite mine. It was clearly a candle, as I could see the dim light flicker in the empty window, and the music sounded like it was coming from an old record player. But in the 10 minutes I watched, I never saw any movement from inside the house. I moved away from the window, sufficiently freaked out, and after another 5 minutes I heard the music abruptly stop. I peeked out again to notice that the light was now out. I never saw anyone. I began to become unsettled in the house, and would often invite friends over to hang out until late. But of course nothing would ever happen when someone else was with me. I never bothered to tell any of my friends, as without evidence I figured they'd just give me shit about it, and I'd just become more agitated. But nothing compared to what happened next. In my living area, the desk sits right next to a small window which looks out to the fence surrounding my property. The steel fence is literally an arm's length from the house and about 6 feet tall, so I always figured that, unlike most of the other windows, I'd never need to cover this one with a sheet or blanket because no one could ever see in. I usually had headphones on when I played, and I always had the lights off for no other reason other than that I preferred to play games in the dark. One night when I was gaming, I got up and walked into the dark kitchen and got a beer out of the fridge. It was dead silent, excluding the faint sound coming out of my headphones. As I closed the fridge and turned around to face the desk, I saw directly out the window 2 very, very faint lights. I didn't even catch on, and immediately started walking back to the desk fixated on the 2 small glowing balls, and it wasn't until I had my nose almost pressed against the glass that I realized the 2 lights weren't lights at all. They were eyes. A set of eyes sitting just above the fence line, staring wide open at me. They didn't blink. They didn't move. My entire body locked up. All I could do was simply stare back as my brain was still comprehending that there was an actual person looking at me in the scariest way I could ever possibly imagine. I don't know what happened. Either my head kicked into gear or my muscles loosened, but my body automatically collapsed, and I fell to the floor, scurrying to hide against the wall away from the window. I could hear my heart beating through the carpet like a drum as I tried to lay as flat as possible, and as my mind was still processing the sheer severity of the situation, a violin started playing. That fucking violin, and the haunting tune it always emitted started up. Except this time it was directly outside my window, and much louder than I'd ever heard it before. The lights were still off, and I wanted to get up to turn off the PC screen, so I couldn't be seen, but my whole body just wasn't ready to cooperate. Not only was the sound of the instrument extraordinarily loud, but it sounded like it was being played with frustration. Notes being missed frequently, and the strings screeching. The pace of it was getting faster and faster, and by this time my dog Jeb out in the backyard had picked up on the situation, and registering an unfamiliar sound gave one solitary deep bark. The violin instantly stopped, and the house was finally dead silent, excluding my headphones, which I could hear quietly working away. I was still frozen to the carpet, and it wasn't until Jeb gave me a second menacing bark that I heard the figure outside the window start to walk away in the direction of my yard. Once that first footstep hit the ground, I instantly thought of the welfare of my best friend, and finally my head connected with my extremities, and my entire body kicked into overdrive. I left from the ground and slid across the laminated floor to the back door where Jeb was standing. I ducked down to keep low and quietly unlocked and slid open the door. Usually doing so would notify Jeb that he was allowed inside, but when the door opened up he didn't move an inch and was completely fixated on the pitch-black backyard. Everything told me not to go outside, but there was no chance I was letting anything happen to my dog, so I moved out onto the alfresco, moved behind Jeb, put my hand under his collar, and attempted to back him towards the house. Jeb is a pure Labrador and weighs like a sack of sand, so when he doesn't want to move it takes sheer force to pull him in the direction you want him to go, and right now Jeb wasn't going anywhere. I yanked at his scruff, and as I did he emitted a bark like I'd never heard before. A deep bellowing fuck-off sound that elevated my nerves to an all-time high. We both just stood there waiting for some form of reply. I couldn't remember how long we both just froze there, but eventually I heard footsteps from around the side of the house begin to walk away, but not a simple walk, almost like whoever was doing it was slowly dancing in a circle. The footsteps keeping to a beat as they drifted away from the house into the distance. Once I couldn't hear anything anymore, Jeb licked his lips, gave me a look, and wandered back inside. I followed, locked the door behind me, and spent the night reverting to my childlike self, hiding under my bed covers with my dog. I didn't sleep at all. That was the last time I ever saw or heard the violin player. The following morning, when the sun finally came up, I called into work sick and called the police. They scoured the lot next to mine and found footprints in the dirt. However, there were so many that it was impossible to tell whose were whose. The only description I could give the officer was his height. He would have had to have been over 6 feet to stare over that fence at me, but they explained that he could have been standing on something or on his toes. They also told me that they've never received a report of anyone playing a violin in the area, or anyone being in the fenced-off hill area either. I essentially looked like an insane person, but the officers were very nice about the whole thing and offered to patrol the area for the next few nights. Nothing else has happened since then. Over the next year or two, people finally started moving in, and I tell them all the story about the figure I saw. Some of them still use the story to keep their children in line, which I found funny. One guy even nicknamed the council lot Violin Hill, and the name has stuck around our street since then. I even spent a period of time scouring the internet for that violin tune I kept hearing, but I could never find it. There were a few classical pieces that seemed reminiscent, but I've since thought that whatever tune was played must have been self-composed, which really creeps me out even more. I'm still in the house, I still tell people the story, and I haven't changed my routine one bit, which has really helped me to block out the fear of the experience. I game with the blinds closed now. I began babysitting at 13 to earn extra money, to spend on horribly embarrassing things like Fall Out Boy CDs. I would almost always work for my dad's clients as he was a lawyer, and get referred by word of mouth. I was babysitting for this one family who had a little girl who was 9 and a little boy who was 7. The parents seemed okay, if a tad crotchety, giving me a full schedule to follow and jokingly threatening to be any boy who might mysteriously show up after they left. It felt cruel for them to accuse me of even knowing a boy, given I basically looked like an overgrown baby with frizzy hair at that age. Almost immediately after the parents leave, the little girl sings in a creepy, high-pitched voice. "We're all alone now." "All right, cue the Shining soundtrack." "I know," the little boy chimed in. "Let's play Rape." Looking back now, I know the kid probably just heard the term on TV, knew the word was shocking, and said it just for a reaction. I totally bought into it at the time, sputtering wide-eyed and changing the subject quickly. These kids were hell for the next hour. I wouldn't let them watch South Park on TV, because their parents did not seem like the type to allow their precious 7- and 9-year-old to watch a show like that. As soon as I said no, the little girl said casually, "Oh, that's fine, we'll just go play PlayStation in the family room. Feel free to watch it out here." A nope, I knew exactly where that was headed. I said they could watch any other TV show in the living room while I made them dinner. The parents had left instructions to make them sandwiches. I could handle that. Before I had even got out the bread, I hear a massive crash. It seems like the little girl has broken a glass. Tootaying and pissed, but ultimately with no way to punish her, I cleaned it up while these two incredibly weird kids watched with wide eyes. Dumping the broken glass in the trash, I went back to making the sandwiches. Now I'm a vegetarian, so while the kids had chicken, I'd made a simple salad one for myself. Just as I was finishing, the little boy screamed out in what sounded like the pantomime of pain. Nonetheless, I ran over to the couch in the living room to check on him. He started screaming my ankle while dramatically flopping back onto the couch. While I tried to figure out how he had hurt his ankle, the little girl slipped out of the room. Peripherally, I was aware of this, but didn't really pay it any mind as I was focused on the little boy pretending to be in pain. He kept saying that he went to stand, but it hurt too much, and he doesn't know, and things like that over and over again, until his eyes suddenly flicked to just behind me, where I could see the little girl standing with a perturbing smile on her face. All of a sudden, he was miraculously healed. Yet praise the Lord. At this point, I was just thinking these kids were really weird, craved attention a little too much, and probably needed more parental involvement. Whatever, I was 13, and that $60 was only 4 hours away. I set out the sandwiches for the two to eat at the dining table, went to get a soda, and returned. After pouring soda for the both of them, I realized they hadn't even taken a bite of their sandwiches yet, so I asked them what they were waiting for. They smiled. "For you to take a bite of yours." I am so glad I had a gut feeling to open the top part of the bread of my sandwich, because when I did, I saw glass. Broken glass. broken glass that I'd put in the trash before. I stared in horror at the two little kids staring at me with menacing twin grins. I lost it shouting, "Are you serious? At the very least you could have really injured my mouth. What is wrong with you two?" Instead of crying or apologizing or pretending to be ashamed or confused, these two little fuckers began laughing. Not like kids. It was too low. It wasn't that silly free laugh kids laugh. It was low and threatening. I'll never forget that noise. My immediate reaction was, these kids are too young to be laughing like that. I called my older sister, who was 17 at the time, cried about what had happened, and she came and took over for me. We left the house with chills after the parents arrived. I never babysat for those two again. What I can't get past is the level of premeditation that went into sprinkling that broken glass into my sandwich, and the totally remorseless way they responded to me getting upset. They were unlike any two kids I've ever met before. And what would a classic Scary Stories video be without the good old smiling man story? About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid, but all of that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street on my side was the silhouette of a man dancing. It was a strange dance similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance walking, headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky, and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still until I could make out his face. His eyes were open wide and wild, and head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off of him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back and then stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I had put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved until I noticed him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I had looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time staring at him, and then he started moving toward me again. He took giant, exaggerated, tiptoed steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone, except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point I ran away, or pulled out my pepper spray, or my cell phone, or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there completely frozen as the smiling man crept toward me, and then he stopped again about a car length away from me, still smiling his smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What I meant to ask was, "What do you want?" In an angry, commanding tone, what came out was a whimper, "What do you?" Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around very slowly and started dance. Walking away just like that, not wanting to turn my back to him again. I just watched him go, until he was far enough away to be almost out of sight, and then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore. Nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way. And this time he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off of the side road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic looking behind me. Then he was nowhere to be found the rest of the way home. I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk, he didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane, and that's a very, very scary thing to see. I lived in a sketchy part of a neighborhood, but I'd never had a job outside than helping my mom, so I was pretty naive and gullible at the time. I was out of high school and looking for a job. I'd worked with my mom junior to senior year cleaning houses, but I wanted to work somewhere else and gain some outside experience. When I graduated high school, my mom and I decided that it was time to look for another job because I needed some money for college. My mom loved to read newspapers, and we would get a Spanish newspaper every single week. I would look through it once in a while to read the comics or see job ads at the end. One evening I was so determined to find an ad that paid well and was something else that would give me another set of work skills. I was going through the classification section at the end of the newspaper when I found what I thought to be the perfect job for me. I don't remember word, but it was something along the lines of looking for young females ages 18 to 25 for an open message position at this location. Now the location they gave was like 0.3 miles away from where I stayed or something, so again I thought it was perfect. I could walk to and from without having to worry about transportation, since we only had one car. Massage training was going to be provided as well, and the pay was really good, and it said that our girls earn anywhere from $500 to $900 a week, and I thought, whoa, what a great wage. I can pay off my college in no time. I was so excited that I fit the profile that I showed my mom the job ad. My mom wasn't excited like I was, and she told me that it looked a little suspicious, that I should call first to see if there really was another person on the other side. So I did call and a lady answered. I asked about the free training, how much do you really make, and where the location was exactly. She seemed really sweet on the phone and told me before we moved forward that they were doing interviews and already had other candidates on their list. She said that I could come in for an interview to see if I would make it to the second round of interviews, and I agreed. She gave me the address and I looked it up, and when I saw that it was only 0.3 miles away from my apartment, I was really happy. So I told my mom that I was going to go to the interview at a set time at this location and alone. She told me that there was no way that I was going to go alone, and she would come with me. I was really mad because I wanted to do this myself without her having to help me, because in my little mind I thought that I was all grown up and didn't need her help. But the day came, and she drove us in the only car that we had. The address that the lady gave me was weird though, because it took us to a motel behind the shopping plaza that was next to our apartment, and it just didn't make any sense to me why I would have an interview there. So we just kind of circled the plaza looking for the place, and my mom got frustrated and told me to just call the lady for the exact location. So I did, and she told me that they were in the motel room such and such number, and that they were there because it was a safety precaution. It seemed to make sense to me, so I told her that I could still not find the place, so if she could speak to my mother and tell her exactly where the place was. And then she said, "You're with your mother?" This time her voice changed from sweet to almost angry, and a panicked one. I said yes, and I'm with her right now because she's driving me, so I passed the phone to my mom, and she said hello 3 times or so. But the lady had just hung up on her, so I called 2 more times, but she just never picked up the phone. I was mad at the lady that she just hung up like that, and so we just went back home. I never did put 2 and 2 together until about 3 years after, when I heard on the news that there was a newspaper job ad that had been busted, and the people were charged with human trafficking. The ad was very similar to the one that I had read years ago, and I thanked my mom over and over, because if it wasn't for her that day, I could have been dead or had been trafficked multiple times by now. I really don't know where I would have ended up. I am so grateful for my mom despite me being so angry at her for coming with me that day, because if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be where I am today, that's for sure. My husband and I met in college. I won't name names for the sake of privacy, but we went to one of those region's oldest colleges, over 200 years old, and it was known to be very haunted. We started dating our freshman year, and we pretty much started living together right away. I was a commuter, so I would stay over in his dorm often, and in our junior year my husband's boyfriend at the time, Jay, landed a suite living situation where he was able to have a bedroom to himself in a larger suite with only 2 guy suite mates. This was the ideal situation for us because it meant that I could basically live with him during the school year, since he didn't have a person sharing a bedroom with him. This living situation was obviously incredibly beneficial for me and my loved ones. Aside from having to share a twin XL bed with a 6 feet 2 inches, 250-pound linebacker, it was pretty awesome, but it didn't take me long at all to realize just how haunted the building was. I have a ton of stories about my experiences in the building and on the campus in general, but explaining them all in one video would be way too long. I'll discuss a few of the big ones though, so there's a bit of context. So Jay was an RA, and had to do a lot work to prepare the suites for all the other students who would be moving in soon, and because of this he was actually able to move in about a week before anybody else. On the day that we were moving Jay's things into the building, I had multiple sightings of a tall, black, shadowy figure. I would always catch it in the corner of my eye, and it would just quickly duck out of sight every time that I did a double take or tried to look at it more closely. I saw this figure probably 4 or 5 times in the move in the day, and didn't think much of it until I remembered that the building was basically empty except for Jay and me. Other experiences too included hearing voices, hearing scratching, banging, thumping at times when it couldn't be explained, a very creepy night alone on campus during a holiday break when a major storm hit and all the power went out more. We had a lot of creepy experiences, but my least favorite part of living in this building was honestly just the feeling that I got being there alone. If I was ever alone in any part of the room, I just immediately would feel a presence enter the space that I was in. It felt intense and loud and really scary. The best way that I can explain it is that it felt like someone was standing beside me and screaming in my face, but there was no sound. We lived with this weird presence the entire time that we were in this building, and we honestly were fine for months, but then something weird started happening. Jay would start waking up in the middle of the night by speaking a different language. I know that saying speaking in tongues sounds ridiculous, but I honestly don't know how else to describe it. I swear that he sounded like he was speaking a completely foreign language, but it was a language that I couldn't identify and had never heard before. He always sounded really intense, and had an almost aggressive tone to his garbled words too, or whatever he was saying, but anyway he woke me up by talking in his sleep like this every night for a few months in fact. It really creeped me out, but I never really said anything about it until one night it scared me so terribly that I honestly had no other choice. So I woke up one night to find Jay was on top of me. Remember that we shared a twin XL bed, and he's a huge guy. I was on my back, and he was straddling me with his palms flat on the bed and by the side of my head. His eyes were wide open, and he was bent down and kind of staring at my face. I immediately was spooked, but just sort of played it off by saying something like, "Hi babe, you good? Is everything okay?" There was no response, and Jay just continued to stare through me, and didn't even move, didn't even blink. I kept this up for a minute or two thinking that he was potentially just being silly, or was groggy from sleep and couldn't form his words. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, but it was really like 3 or 4 minutes maybe. He then got off me, climbed over to me to get out of bed, and stood still in the room for a few seconds. After that he turned sharply to look at the desk and the chair in the bedroom. He pulled the chair out from the desk, turned it around 180 degrees so that it was facing him, walked around the chair 3 times in a circle, and then stood back to face the chair directly. He stood staring at the seat of the chair for about a minute, and then got back into bed with me, and then just immediately fell asleep. The entire time that this was happening, I was just kind of watching with my mouth wide open. I know that I tried to call to him, get his attention a few times to see what he was doing, but at a certain point all I could do was just sort of watch him bewilder. But this was definitely the strangest thing that had ever happened to me. I told Jay all about what he did the next morning, and he was really upset because it scared me so badly. He is also not and has never been a sleepwalker or a sleep talker. Shortly after this event, though, I decided to cleanse the place with some help from a friend. We did, and things really quietened down after that. Jay continued to talk in his sleep every now and again for the rest of that school year, and even here and there for the next school year. We've been married and living in our own place since we graduated almost 2 years now, and I haven't heard Jay sleep talk or seen him sleepwalk a single time since we left living on campus. I know deep down that that building was haunted, and I really believe that whatever it was attached to Jay for some reason, and to speak through him or something. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I'm sorry that this is a bit long. I tried to condense it as much as possible to make it an easy listen, but if anyone has any ideas as to what was going on in that building, I would love to hear from them. I want to start by saying that I'm a stay-at-home mom, a very stay-at-home loner mom with a family so far away that it doesn't feel right to have them worry. Tonight, I tucked my oldest kid into bed, and on my way out to my new nightly ritual of feeding my neighbor's cat. My husband made a joke about wanting corn dogs from 7-Eleven. I don't get out much and don't mind, so I said that we needed milk anyways, and I just went on my way. The neighbor's was uneventful, except that one hellcat hooked her nail into my middle finger when I was giving her treats. Because of this too, I left earlier than usual, and I headed straight to the store. It's just after 9 p.m., and I pull up to the 7-Eleven, parking alongside the building, unobstructed windows spanning the entire length of the building. It's well lit. I immediately notice a gentleman in blue standing up on the sidewalk. I pay no mind but start gathering my things. My finger still really hurts, so I'm taking my time and cursing that gorgeous cat when I hear a man's voice mumble something. My window is partially open, but my windshield is already fogging up, and when I look up I see that he's walking towards my passenger side. He starts trying to open my door, but thank God that my kids broke that door handle and it won't open. I immediately step out of my car, and with me standing in my open door, looking out across the windshield, I say, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" Then he starts saying over and over, "Are you the yellow cab? Are you the yellow cab?" I say again, "I don't know you. I'm not letting you in my car." He realizes that he can't get in and people are watching, so he starts walking away from my car and I run inside. I am a little shaken, I'll admit, but I try to sum it up to mistaken identity. We live in a small town and our cabs are just random cars, so I'm walking around and trying to make sure that he isn't near my car, and at one point I see him looking like he was walking away. I call my husband and tell him a little bit about what happened just to hear him say that it's probably nothing, but corn dogs in hand I walk out and head towards my car. The visions of this guy in my back seat flashing through my head. I see him walking away from my car, but now he has a backpack. Something flashes on the side of the pack, and it hits me that I didn't lock my doors when I ran inside, and this piece of shit mother lover has my 5-year-old son's backpack. I don't know what the hell I was thinking, but I walked maybe 2 feet from my car and yelled, "That's my son's backpack." I thought that he might bolt, but he actually started walking back towards me instead. I said again, "That's my son's backpack," and he again starts saying, "Are you the yellow cab?" I yell louder, "That's my son's backpack," and give it back to me. For a millisecond, I even consider the fact that this might not be my son's backpack, and I panic, but I'm convinced in the moment that I see the bus pass. This man is still going on about the yellow cab, and I looked at him furious. Mama Bear is pissed. I take an extra long look at what he was wearing, and they were hospital blue pajama pants and a deep but vibrant blue hoodie with a WOD logo, and the O has some sort of hemisphere lines of something. All of this happens in a few seconds, and I just remember looking at him pissed and telling him that he's effed for stealing a little kid's backpack and to get the hell out of here. Maybe it's because I live in Canada, or maybe it was because I didn't leave the area where I could be seen, but he started walking away. I went inside immediately and told the clerks, but I didn't think any of us knew what to do. For a second I was going to call the cops, but it was just a backpack after all, but I just couldn't help but think about him trying to get into the car with me in it. So in the end I called the police. I started telling them what was happening, and then I saw the guy again. I followed him while on the phone, and I parked way ahead of him. Time passes quickly when you're on the phone with the cops, and the guy passes my car. He turns back and sees that it's me and turns around. I haven't turned off my car, so I panic, but I shift into drive and start driving away. This man wasn't scared. He was actually walking back to my car, and as I'm driving away I tell the officer, "What the hell is he thinking? This is so dangerous." I gave you his description and his general location. I've got to go home. We finished the conversation on the way, and I gave them my info and the guys as well. I really can't tell you why I followed him as well. I mean, I follow a lot of true crime, and I guess that I just couldn't not report a man trying to get into my car, right? I told the police the same as well, and we got off the phone, and I went inside. Now my husband is good at pointing out people's hardships, and it's clear that this man had mental health issues, and I suspect some sort of addiction issue as well. He was rather thin with large scabs on his face. He kind of dumbed down how I felt about it, and I think that's why I wanted to share this. What happened? It actually scared me, and I don't know why I did what I did, but maybe it was silly. I don't know. All of it seems stupid, I suppose, but I approached the guy. I drove after him, and I know that I'm ridiculously slow sometimes, but I did get the backpack back, but it was stupid, I know. Anyway, I received a phone call 5 minutes before I started writing this, and the police, they actually got him. He is going to the station for the night because he's extremely intoxicated. The officer's words were, we pulled up with our lights on, and he asked if we wear a yellow cap. A part of me feels like maybe he was just drunk or something, but a part of me also thinks that this guy was using that as an excuse as to why he would be thinking to get into my car like that. I definitely had an adrenaline rush, and now I'm just really tired, but if you've gotten this far then thanks for listening, and man, what a weird night. This all happened in 2007 when I was 9 years old and my friend Hannah was 8. Now every summer her parents would take us to a campsite about maybe 3 hours from home in northern Ontario, Canada. This campsite was in the Boer Wash district. You can Google search the prison for more information. But anyways, camp consisted of a few cottages or trailers set up in a large park on the shore of a large lake. Each summer we'd be greeted by our friends that we'd made the previous years, and we'd have ample fun. This year though was different because we met a girl named Emily, but she was our age but shy. She'd never eat or stay over too late. We always assumed her parents were just strict. We had sleepovers, took photos together, and she kind of became the third in our Three Musketeers group setting. One day we were actually swimming. There was a floating dock with a slide in it, and we decided to each take our turn to go down to make the biggest splashes. My turn came, and for some reason I was carried under the dock, and as I was trying to maneuver out from under it, Emily began holding me under the entire time. She wouldn't let go of me, and finally Hannah grabbed me and pulled me up. We both got out of the water and ran to the camp, and we were pretty freaked out that our friend would try what I saw as drowning. The next day was the last day that we were at the camp. Emily came by and acted like nothing happened. She spent the day trying to convince us to walk along a river to a huge building. She said it was just a few hours away, but we could spend our last day there, and we'd have so much fun. We both felt like something was off though, and decided that we better not go. Nothing else happened after that, and we kind of just went home, and the following year Emily wasn't there. A few years ago though, we were looking at our camp pictures while celebrating my 18th birthday. When we reached the 2007 photos, we noticed Emily was missing from them. Curiously, we asked Hannah's mom, who told us she always assumed that Emily was our imaginary friend, that she had never actually seen Emily. In the photos that we have, you can clearly tell that we left spacing for Emily in between myself and Hannah in most of our photos. We decided to, without speaking to one another, write down the characteristics about Emily that would define her, and amazingly we wrote down the exact same thing. Green eyes, brown hair to the shoulder, very fair in skin tone, and very skinny. What freaks me out the most though, is that I remember being trapped under that dock, and I remember her holding me there. But if she wasn't real, then what was holding me under the dock? There was no way that we both imagined the same girl, same name, same experiences and descriptions of her. We also remember her trying to get us to follow a river, and we realized that the river actually went to the prison. But when we started reading up on the prison too, we realized that apparently there were tons of encounters that people have had there. Now to be clear, I'm not a both saw Emily and why she tried to drown me, or why she wanted to lure us out to a prison, but needless to say we did visit said prison in the middle of the night, and that in its own is a completely different story that I may someday write about, but I still cannot explain who Emily was and how we both saw her, the same little girl, and why she wanted me drowned, and why she wanted us at the prison. I'm wondering though, have any of you guys had a similar experience? This was maybe 5 years ago now, and to this day it gives me the creeps. So I was with my buddy on our way to a friend's house to catch a UFC fight. We had stopped at the store for a case of beer, and on the way to my friend's house we missed the turn. Luckily in that neighborhood all of the streets are sort of connected, so instead of doing a U-turn, I just told my buddy just catch the next turn and do a full circle, so we can turn around like that. The streets are pretty narrow, so it's a residential area, and we're in a pickup truck with 24-inch rims, and while he starts slowing down, and I'm looking at a scratch off to see if I won when my buddy goes, "Hey look, someone's husky is just sitting in the middle of the road." I look up, and I'm like, nah man, that's way too big to be a husky, so I told him to switch to his high beams, and as soon as he did whatever it was, did not like it. So like I said, my friend's truck is sitting on big wheels, and this thing still looked huge. It was maybe less than 10 feet away from us. When the light hit it, it turned its head, and when I say that we saw a human face on this thing, I mean that we could make out eyes, nose, mouth, everything. Then it literally just spread these big-ass wings and took flight. No noise from the wings and nothing. We literally had to pull over to the side of the road to just kind of evaluate what the hell we just saw. We got to my friend's house and told them what we just saw, but they didn't take us seriously, and we still don't know what the hell we saw that night. I was 12 years old at the time that this happened. It was the summer of 1984, and I was out of school for the season, and this particular day my mom had to go out. She told me that she would be back in about half an hour, and then she left, and after a few minutes I realized that I needed to use the bathroom. I went to use the normal upstairs bathroom, but I realized at that moment that I left my Archie comic in the downstairs bathroom. I deeply disliked the basement, and I seriously disliked the downstairs bathroom, but sometimes it was necessary to use it if someone else was in the other one. I decided that I would just run down to grab my comic and head back up the stairs to do my business. So I headed downstairs on the run, but by the time that I reached the bathroom, I realized that the need to go was so urgent that I had no time to make it back up the stairs. So I sat down in the bathroom after locking the door and made the best of it. Now this bathroom was small, and when I mean small I mean really tiny. When I sat on the toilet, for instance, the corner of the sink sat just above my left knee, and if I stretched my arm out in front of me, I could touch the other side of the room where shower stall curtain was. Directly to the right of me was the door, and I could easily touch the doorknob and the lock above the handle as well. The lock consisted of nothing more than a hook and ideal, and wouldn't stand up to anyone pulling on it hard, as it would simply come out of the wall. But it was enough that if someone tried the door that it would give them reasonable resistance, and then they would realize that the bathroom was already in use. Simple enough and generally sufficient for what it was needed for, I suppose. But anyway, so when I went into the bathroom, even though nobody was home at the time, I shut the door and slipped the metal hook into the eye and thought nothing of it at the time. I quickly got lost in the world of Archie Andrews and the gang of characters that went to Riverdale High until I heard a noise above me. I knew nobody was home, but perhaps someone had come home while I was downstairs. I stopped reading and was listening intently when I heard the first heavy footsteps on the basement stairs. It was unusually loud as well, and sounded like whoever it belonged to was really large and very, very heavy. I knew how many stairs there were, so as the heavy thudding on the stairs came slowly and deliberately closer, I counted. 1, 2, 8, 9, 14, 16. I thought that I was scared by the time that it reached the third stair, but by the time that it had reached the 10th, I could actually hear it, and it just took my breath away. As it descended, the sound of like rushing air and sort of laughter came floating down the stairs and the hallway through the bathroom door, and it gave me the shivers. I could hear it round the corner as it came to the bottom of the stairs and down the hallway towards me. I dropped the Archie book on the floor in a panic and grabbed for the door handle as I realized that it was now just outside the bathroom door. I could hear this rushing of wind still, and this laughter all at one time, sort of jumbled together like many voices and calling out sort of names or something. I held onto the doorknob with all my might as it began to twist and turn in my hands as whatever was outside the door tried to get inside the bathroom with me. The door shook with the violent tugging from the other side, threatening to tear the door from the very hinges. I thought ironically for a moment that it was a good thing that I was sitting on the toilet right then, because otherwise what was going so freely into the toilet would have definitely been flowing down my legs. Time seemed to sort of stretch on as the struggle continued, and I battled with whatever was on the other side of the door for possession of the doorknob, but I don't really know for just how long it went. It could have been only seconds or perhaps even minutes, but for however long it was, the tears were rushing down my cheeks, and I screamed in terror the entire time, and then just in a sort of single moment it stopped, and I was by myself in the bathroom, still shrieking in terror at nothing. The noise was gone, the tugging and the pulling of the door was over, and there was just nothing. I sat there shaking violently for what seemed like an eternity, not daring to let go of the doorknob, lest that beast I had wrestled with was still on the other side of the door, silently waiting to hear them, let go, and breathe a sigh of relief only to pounce and tear the door from its hinges. In fact, I didn't even relax a single muscle until I heard my mum's footsteps above me and heard her coughing. I screamed to her that I was downstairs and to come down and help. Mum came rushing down after a few moments and asked if I was in the bathroom. I said yes, that I would be out in just a minute, and I quickly cleaned up and hesitantly opened the door, hoping that it was really my sweet mum and not a horrible trick of some kind. But it really was my mum, and I threw myself into her arms sobbing and trying to tell her what just happened. She looked at me skeptically and said, "What's your blood sugar?" I said, "What?" And again she said, "What's your blood sugar, but when was the last time you checked it?" I had been diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic just 2 years before this, and although I did take great care of myself on my own, I still needed my parents' help from time to time, and she obviously thought that this was one of those times. I realized that once again she didn't believe me, instead thinking that it must be my overactive imagination, and that it may have also been related to low blood sugar or something of that sort. So I went upstairs and took my blood sugar for her, and I don't really remember what it was, but it definitely was okay. But I was left with remaining sadness that my mother didn't believe me, and it wasn't the first time odd things had happened, and it definitely wasn't the last either. But years later, the way things turned out, she would eventually believe me just fine. I know that this story is going to sound a bit like bullshit, but I can assure you that it actually happened to my cousin and I in the summer of 2018. My cousin and I live pretty close to each other in the suburbs of Detroit. We both love photography and taking long drives listening to music, so that's exactly what we did on this particular day. We drove for about an hour to a small town and found an abandoned barn that was more so for sale. At the time we actually didn't spot any trespassing signs, so we decided to be adventurous and go and check it out, but boy was that a big mistake. So the barn was in semi-decent condition, although the paint had begun to peel off. Structurally it was pretty sound though, so I didn't feel uneasy about going inside of it. I'm an avid urban explorer in Detroit, and had been in far worse buildings up to this stage. Once we got inside, we somehow ended up in the basement of this barn though, and man was I immediately getting some weird-ass vibes in there. There were little girls' clothes and toys and furniture just littered throughout the basement of this barn, and I thought it was creepy as hell, and so did my cousin. Before I continue though, behind the barn was a pretty decent-sized cornfield. This cornfield backed up right into the barn, so we decided to be artsy and take a few pics in the corn stalks. I snap a few shots of my cousin, and we decide it's time to head back to the car, but walking through the first row of corn on my way back to my cousin's car, I see a vertebrae in the dirt, and at this point I stop dead in my tracks in disbelief, like, is this actually what I think it is, or is this an animal bone of some kind? I start looking around, and oh shit, there were several more. They were too big to be a deer, and I yell for my cousin, who was almost back to the car now, and have her take a look, but we both start really examining the ground, and we find more and more bones. Now for the record, too, I had actually taken cadaver lab and human anatomy in college, so I'm very familiar with the human body. We found a fibula and a fully intact femur, and that's when I really started to freak the hell out. We decided to call the cops because we knew that this was serious at this stage. We wait in the car for a good 15 minutes, totally freaking out, until the cops arrived. Once the cops came, there was 2 of them. We all started looking through the corn and nearby trash pile. The cops I don't think believed us at first, and I distinctly remember them saying that they thought it was a deer carcass. That was until I found a full-blown rib cage in the trash pile, and then they changed their tune real quick. The cops told us that they would need us to leave, and that they were calling for a full forensics team out to start collecting evidence and whatnot. We were totally shaken up, and on the way out I finally saw that no trespassing sign, and I'm sure the cops did too, but they just didn't care at that stage. We gave the cops our information, but we never did hear anything from them. I also watched the news pretty closely for the next few weeks, and I didn't see anything, but this was definitely one of the most creepy things that I've ever experienced. So I was listening to a story on here that reminded me of my experience. I'm 21 now, but I was around 13 when this happened. So first off, I want to say that I know that this sounds really fake, but the whole thing to me was just odd. My friend and I, both girls, were sleeping out in a tent in a paddock and just talking about school and sports, etc. It was pretty late, but we were so ecstatic to even be allowed out of the tent that we weren't sleeping. I decided that I wanted to scare her, so I pretended that I could hear breathing outside. I acted super scared and said something along the lines of, "Oh my goodness, can you hear that? Someone's outside the tent." She became super quiet, like she was trying to listen, and her face kind of dropped. Keep in mind, I was completely joking until I actually heard breathing. I thought that I was making it up in my head, as it was just too weird of a coincidence to joke about it, and then for it to actually happen. I look over at her, and she mouths, "I can hear it," and we're both frozen, and sit there staring at each other, not knowing what to do. The breathing, it was pretty heavy, which made it 10 times scarier, literally starts circling the tent, and we hear footsteps that sound as though they're trying to be quiet. We sat there for about 2 minutes in complete fear. The breathing kind of stops, and the footsteps abruptly sprint off behind the back end of the tent. We then see a faint blue and red light coming up her driveway. Her dad was a cop, so we thought that it was him, although I don't know why he wouldn't have his lights going, but we were 13, so we weren't the brightest. Anyway, we both took this as an opportunity to sprint across the paddock to the driveway, which was around 600 meters away, and we get to the cop, who wasn't her dad. Her dad then comes out of the house confused, as there's a cop and 2 girls who were supposed to be asleep with panicked faces. We then learned that it was an unstable guy who stole a car around their area and fled up through people's backyards trying to hide. The part that I found most messed up though was the fact that I tried to scare her with some bullshit lie, and then it actually happened. So my family and I moved into a new house, which is a 2x4 house. It used to have an attic, but it's been sealed off. After a couple of months since I'm living in this house, sometimes I'm just watching TV, and I hear scratching from the roof. I just play it off as a bird, as they're common where we live. After 3 weeks, the scratching has gotten worse though, and more frequent. It was kind of like it was trying to scratch its way out of the roof. By the way, too, the attic entrance thing is above the outside of my sister's room. One day my sister tells my dad that the seal is open. My dad gets confused because it was supposed to be sealed off. My dad goes to close it and realizes that it's actually really hard to open and close, so whatever opened it must have been pretty strong, and that was the point when I started to get skeptical. The same night I go to get some snacks from the fridge, and I open it to find out that they're gone. I thought that my siblings must have eaten it, and in the morning my parents are going on about a missing cake, because that cake was supposed to be for my niece's birthday. They asked if I had anything to do with it, and I said no along with my siblings. I was getting really suspicious about the attic though, so I built up the courage to go and check it out. Note too that I'm probably the most paranoid person in the world, so I was scared for my life, but my curiosity got the better of me. I get the ladder, a torch, and a knife just in case I open the opening thingy, whenever it's called. I shine my torch in there to see nothing, but as I search more I see the cake, empty snack packets, dirty clothes, and a short dark silhouette. It just freezes in its spot. Immediately I bolt and scream for my parents, and I tell them everything. They tell me to stay in my room, and they go up and check it out, but when they do, whoever was there was gone. I'm still pretty shook up from that moment, and I still get nightmares from it from time to time. We have since moved on from that house, and now live a normal non-scary life, but it's certainly something that I'll never forget. This happened yesterday, and I still can't believe that it happened. I'm still pretty freaked out, and I'll explain it all at the end, so I'm sorry if it's a bit confusing as I'm telling it. So I've recently moved into a new flat 3 weeks ago, and I'm sharing it with my sister. The only person we know properly is a single mom who lives in the apartment next door to us. Ever since we moved in, she's been giving us advice and helping us out with things, but we don't know anyone else properly yet. From what we've seen of our neighbors, though, they're mostly couples in their 30s or 40s or older guys who live alone, but we're probably the youngest ones here. We're both females. I'm 18, and my sister is only 60. So today I was out with friends, and then later on I went to the gym. After this I went to get my sister so that we could go out for some food, and we got in around 10 p.m. I think. Me and my sister, though, we got into our pajamas, and were just sitting around watching TV when our buzzer rang. I jumped up to answer it, and it turned out to be our neighbor, the single mom. I asked her what was up, and she said that our dad was asking for us downstairs. Straight away my stomach dropped, and I immediately asked her if she was sure that he said that he was our dad. The reason I asked her was to just make sure that that's actually what she said, but she replied that yeah, he said that he was our dad and was asking for us. The neighbor asked me if she could let him into our flat, but I told her not to do that. I wanted to tell my sister, but I also didn't want to worry her right away, so I asked the neighbor not to let anyone come up yet, and I heard her repeat this to him. I couldn't hear anything for a few minutes after this, and I started to get really worried. At this point my sister comes up to me and asks who it is. I start to feel really anxious and call out to my neighbor a few times. It must have only been about 5 minutes, but it felt like ages when she didn't reply. I was actually about to tell my sister to call the police when eventually she told me that he was gone. She then came up to our flat and explained what went down. She said that she was walking to her flat after finishing work, and she saw a man by the buzzards. At first she assumed that he was just somebody who lived there until he noticed her walking up, and he asked for us by name and if she could let him up to our flat. She asked him who he was, and he told her that he was our dad. Now obviously she then buzzed us and told us first, as our neighbor doesn't know us that well, so she doesn't know what our dad looks like. She said that because you were young she didn't want to buzz a strange man up to our flat. She said that her mother instincts kicked in when she heard my hesitation to let him up to the flat as well. Apparently after he heard me say that, as well, he got really pushy with her and started trying to move her out of the way. He kept saying to her, "It's okay, I'm their dad, let me in, I'm not going to do anything." She started arguing with him and asked him to tell her his name, but he refused to tell her. She told him that if I don't feel comfortable letting him in, then there's no way that he was getting in. His reaction was to call her a bitch and then get in a car and ride away. Now this is the reason why I hesitated in the first place. So we haven't spoken to our dad since I was like 16. We even considered getting a restraining order from him at one point. He's not our biological father, but we were legally adopted by him when I was 9. He was physically and verbally abusive to our mom, and had actually started to do the same thing with me. It got to the point where we had to leave in the middle of the night, in fact, and after this he became very controlling and would secretly follow us and record me and my sister. He has a criminal record as well, and I do believe that he was convicted of manslaughter in the 80s. I have no idea of the backstory behind that, and I honestly don't want to know, but like I said, we haven't heard from him since, so as soon as she said the word dad, I almost had a panic attack. I asked her to describe him, and she said that because it was dark out she couldn't really see, and in the end we ended up staying with her because me and my sister were really shaken up. I don't know whether to call the police or not, and I'm really lost on this one. I don't know if it's our dad or not, as it could easily just be somebody else, but I sure would appreciate some advice. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this one. So me and my friend were walking towards a park to just go and hang out, and we discovered this sewer system. We decided to check it out because we were stupid and there was a grate covering it, but the bars were bent open enough that me and her could squeeze in. She had a really bad feeling about it. She's a super intuitive person when it comes to paranormal stuff, but I just kind of ignored it and went further in. Now there was this big room area that the grate led into, and it had a grate on the top where the light was shining through. There was a big tunnel leading right and a small tunnel up high that I couldn't reach on the left. The room was partially filled with water at the bottom, and there was some graffiti on the walls of the tunnel. As I looked to the left it was super dark, so I couldn't see very well, but a long ways down there was another grate, and there was some light leaking. It was at this stage that I could barely make out some sort of a long lanky thing stretched out that looked like a really skinny arm. I couldn't see a body attached to it because it was further away from me where it was darker, and I could only see it because it was in front of the light, so it was kind of shining behind it and made it pop out. Sorry if that's worded weird, but I don't know how else to describe it. All you need to know though is that I could see a part of it but not the other part, and it looked like an arm stretched out and it wasn't moving. I just kind of ignored it, thinking that it may just be a plank of wood or something propped up because there were some planks of wood in the room that I was in. I decided to stack some rocks by the left tunnel so that I could reach it and look in, and as I looked through the tunnel there was another room far beyond the tunnel, and it had a grate on top like my room, and the light was leaking in also, but then I noticed this gray hunched over figure with an extremely bony body. It didn't have any clothes or hair from what I could see anyway. Its body looked super malnourished. I couldn't see its head or its legs since the tunnel was really small. All I could really see was its back, part of its neck, and the tops of its arms. It wasn't moving, and by this point obviously I was freaking out. I went to my friend and told her what I saw. I asked for her phone so that I could take a picture to show her since she refused to go back into there, and I took the picture, and then we hightailed it out a bit. Sadly I don't have the pictures anymore, because the phone it was taken on had actually gotten lost at some stage in my life. We've gone back a couple of times to try and get more pictures, but never saw anything like it since. The tunnels were just empty, but after some research, I must say that I think the figures were either crawlers or greys, or maybe something like that. If anyone has any information on greys, then please let me know, because I can't really find much about them. Again, sorry if this is badly worded, but I'm not the best writer, and it's super late here. If anyone needs me to elaborate on something though, I would be happy to do so in the comments below. Also, if you have any idea of what it was or have a similar experience, then I would love to know. Thanks for listening. I was 18, living in college dorms several hours from home and working as a waitress at an upscale bar and restaurant. I'm short, barely 5 foot in fact, so I'm used to people being creepy and trying to intimidate me now, but as an 18-year-old whose father had tried to protect her from the world, and having been raised in a tiny friendly town, it never occurred to me to be scared of the people who lurk in the dark. So we had plenty of regulars, several of whom I became close with during my years working here, and a few of the frequent diners learned my name and general facts about me, since I'm generally pretty open about who I am. One such man was tall, lanky, and several decades older, appearing to be in his mid-50s, I would guess. Joe. Joe was kind, a good man with a generous nature who owned a local shoe shop. The second time I was his waitress, he gifted me a pair of slightly worn work shoes, insisted that I accept them. Because of his kindness and the way that he carried himself, people of all types flocked to him, and one of them became the first man outside of my family that I actually feared. Joe came in with his younger brother one day, about the same height, slightly a bulkier build, and not unattractive as I recall, but his eyes just always unsettled. In high school I sort of fancied myself a bit of a writer, but nothing in my vocabulary then or now could help me describe just how unsettling his gaze was. It seemed almost dead, lifeless, but I assumed that I was just simply nervous. I mean, Joe was a good man. His brother was probably just less carefree and more intense or something. The two dined together a few times in the coming weeks, but while Joe would normally request me as a server, he asked our host to assign one of the other servers to his table after the first time. Then one night Joe's brother came in alone and requested me by name, and I was happy to oblige. For the first time he seemed relaxed, energetic, and charismatic even. He was interesting with a quick wit and a story for every topic that I could throw at him. By the end of the shift I assumed that he just had a hard time relaxing with his brother, and that may have been true, but through the laughter and the charisma his eyes never once seemed kind. They remained through it all lifeless. Eventually though it was time for me to leave, but he was still there, still expecting service, so my manager offered to take over the table. He'd make sure I got the tip, but it was common knowledge that I had an early morning class and likely had to do my homework. So I jumped at the chance, but went to finish some closing duties and asked the man at my last table if he needed anything else. He seemed off too. As soon as I said that I was heading home, he seemed to sort of harden. His face was clipped and sort of reminded me of my controlling ex-stepdad, which immediately put me on edge. I'd seen the same thing often enough as a little girl right before being hit, so I left immediately. I called my best friend and offered to buy him dinner if he'd meet me at the diner between the dawns and my work. I don't know why I did, but I just felt that I needed someone to meet me sooner rather than late. Joe's brother hadn't in any way seemed dangerous outside of the tenseness in his voice before I left, but I knew that for most of my walk, which would have been poorly lit, I would be safer with a companion. So we met at the diner, we ate and laughed, and headed back to the dorms. A good 25-minute walk, but only 15 or so, and the hairs on the back of my neck just seemed to burn. Something was really terrifying me, and I couldn't figure out why. I told my friend, who brushed it off until he looked behind me and yelled. I turned, and that's when I saw him, Joe's brother, only a few yards behind us holding a metal bar. I don't know what they're called, but you see them at the construction sites, usually for reinforcement when pouring concrete and whatnot, and he was holding it hard enough that his knuckles were white. It terrified me obviously, and I screamed. My friend grabbed my arm, and we just booked it, and even though my heart was in my throat, and I couldn't hear anything past the blood roaring in my ears, I swear that I could hear his footsteps behind us. We ran to the dorms, and I told the security, who had us wait in the office while he looked at the cameras in the lot, and called the police. The cops showed, but they did nothing since all that he did technically was scare us. After they left, the security man asked us a few more questions, and made a comment about a man standing at the entrance door for a bit before walking away. He assumed he was homeless, but my blood ran cold. I called in sick for a few days, and when I went back to work, Joe was in. I told him what had happened, and he nodded, didn't even seem to question the validity of what I said. His brother, it turned out, had done some time for stalking and even attacking young women, and had even been sent to trial for assaulting and hospitalizing him. Somehow he managed to avoid jail time for the assault, but Joe said that it was only a matter of time before he actually killed someone. I didn't see Joe often after that, and I never did see his brother again. The owner of restaurant was angry, for a long time accused me of running off a regular who spent a lot of money when he came in. It took me a few more encounters to make me a little more cynical, but Joe's brother, he was the one to break me out of my naivety. I came over from Serbia at age 13 of my mother. My older brother, who was 15 years older than me, had lived in America for a few years, and he sent for us. My mom wouldn't be staying, although at the time I wasn't aware of that, but we landed in New York City, and the plan was that my brother would come and get us. However, my niece decided to come early, and my brother's wife went into labor shortly before we landed. My brother couldn't leave his wife, obviously, so he asked a coworker of his ledger of cabs to pick us up in New York City and drive us to New Jersey, where him and my sister-in-law lived. When we got to New York City, we awaited in customs for what seemed like forever. We looked for my brother, but we didn't see him. This was the early 90s, and cell phones weren't as commonplace, and even if they were, my mom didn't have them. So we panicked a bit, not seeing my brother or my sister-in-law, when suddenly we heard our names being called and saw a tall man. He introduced himself in perfect Serbian and explained that he was a good friend of my brother's, and then told us about the baby, and he said that he'd be driving us the 2 hours from the airport to my brother's home. My mom finally relaxed, and they happily began to converse about the baby and my brother in America. I, however, just felt off. This guy gave me bad vibes, and regardless of my brother's friendship with him, I felt distrustful of him. We drove for a good hour, though, and a half, when he announced that he was going to take us out for breakfast. We hadn't eaten in like 15 hours, so we were starving by then. We pulled up to a house, and my mom and I were really confused. He insisted cheerfully that his wife was cooking us breakfast, and after we would drive the rest of the way to the hospital to see my family. My mom shushed me when I whispered something didn't feel right, and told me that we needed to be grateful for the hospitality, and so we were let into the house. It was really dark and dank and sort of dirty, and suddenly I think my mom finally got a bit nervous and started insisting that he take us to my brother. Suddenly the guy grabbed my mom by the wrist. He told her that he needed a wife to take care of him in his house, and when he heard my brother tell the others at work that she'd be coming to stay, he knew that he'd found a wife. I at the time was a scrawny little scamp of a kid, and I tried pushing him off my mum, but he hit me so hard that I just saw stars. At this point we were terrified and neither of us really spoke English. We only knew my brother's home number, and he was at the hospital. Also in Serbia you don't dial 911, so even if I could I didn't know that that was how I could call the police anyway. So he tells my mum that she's to clean and cook for him, and he takes me to the basement where I was locked in what I now know is called the laundry room. I banged and cried and yelled, but it was so far down in the basement that everything was muffled. For a week we were kept in this, and for a whole week we were kept in his home. He would lock us up in the basement after my mum cooked him breakfast, and he'd let us out when he would come home at 4. If we had to use there was a bathroom, but that was it, just a bathroom and a laundry room. It was freezing cold down there, and even us huddling together under a blanket did basically nothing. One morning though I discovered a small window by climbing on some boxes. I managed to open it, and my mother insisted that I squeeze through it. I didn't want to leave her, and besides how would I get help if I couldn't read or speak the language? But I didn't want to live this way the rest of my life, so I did what she asked. I ran once I got out, and I'm sure that I was a sight, a scrawny boy with no shoes only wearing shorts and a t-shirt in the middle of November. However, that is what saved us as several concerned neighbors tried to get me to come to them, and I was so terrified. I kept trying to get them to follow me. The police were called, and a very nice policeman tried to get me to go into his car, and then I saw the man who'd taken us drive up in his taxi. He saw the cops and he just took off. That was when I made a run for his house to get my mum, and needless to say the cop and his partner ran after me, and my mother was rescued. It took about another 4 hours for them to find someone who spoke our language for us to tell them what happened. A warrant was issued for the man, my brother was contacted. His friend had told him we never showed up, and my brother had been frantically calling back home in Serbia to find us. He drove up to get us, and to give the cops information on his supposed friend, so they could find him, but they never did. Back then before 911 it was easy for someone to disappear. However, it made me very distrustful for a long time of people and their intentions. My mum grew homesick eventually as well, and she ended up going back to Serbia. I stayed and I finished school, and I ended up becoming a cop in the military thanks to the nice officer that helped me all those years ago. This took place when I was fairly young. I can't exactly pinpoint an age because this was a more persistent phenomenon that went on for quite a while, but roughly though from when I was maybe 5 to 10 years old I would guess. I lived in a smaller community at the time, and there was a river that my group of friends used to play near to and several other bodies of water, mainly small streams and ponds and stuff like that. But we also often played in a nearby forest, as kids do I suppose. We were in groups of 8 at most, and maybe 2 or 3 at least. We did typical kid stuff, and grew pretty familiar with the part of the forest that we played in. Now I have some very vivid memories spanning from almost as long as I can remember, to when my family moved away about someone calling my name. This was especially often when I was with a smaller group of friends. The voices were sometimes my parents or neighbors or someone I didn't recognize, but they were definitely adult voices, if that makes sense. For instance, I would hear my dad calling my name several times even though he was at work, but sometimes he was in another country in fact. My house is definitely out of earshot too from the area that I played in, and my mum was often preoccupied with looking after my sister or her work, and the point is that she definitely wasn't the one calling me either. I was a really obedient child as well, a bit of a goody two-shoes I suppose. I would usually always obey when adults told me to do something or come to them when they called. It definitely sounded as if these voices were trying to lure me away from my group. My friends said that they never heard the voices when I asked, so I stuck to the group and continued whatever game that we were playing. This would usually happen in the forest, but sometimes also when we played near the river as well, and the voices just came from directions that never really made sense. Deeper into the woods, closer to the river, away from my house, away from my group. They never did say anything, but my name even when I called back to them. I rarely ever went to this place alone, but sometimes I'd feel like I was just being watched even though nobody was there. Sometimes I got the urge to run away out of the forest, and I never ignored it, just dropped everything and started running. I don't know how relevant this information is too, but I know that a young boy drowned in that river that we used to play at in the time frame this phenomenon happened to me. I realize that this all sounds a bit silly and just something that kids do or imagine, but I used to see things a lot as a kid as well, mostly when I was really young. My parents said I'd often come to them and speak about angels or fairies or something that I met in the tall grass or near the woods. They sometimes heard me talking to thin air, as kids do, I suppose. I definitely did not have an imaginary friend, but I do have vague memories of seeing these things too. Sometimes they scared me, but a lot of the time they didn't. The voices in the forest also didn't sound scary every time, but they always weirded me out because I didn't know what kept calling. This phenomenon, though, it stopped after my family moved, and I stopped playing in those woods, which is really strange. But I recently went back to the area for nostalgia's sake, and I didn't hear the voices, but for some reason the place just gave me a massive headache, and my friend, and I went back earlier than planned. But there was still this area that really creeped me out as well. As kids we called it the dark side. A bit cringy, I know, but we were very little, and it was a part of the forest that we never really entered. I remember too that I always just walked around it as a kid. But anyway, what do you guys think about all this? Do you think that something was actually calling my name from the forest, or is it all just in my head? In December of 2013, during my sophomore year of college, my at-the-time boyfriend David had a fraternity dinner banquet that I attended with him. It was a nice event requiring everyone to dress up. He was in a suit, I was in dress and heels. It's important for later, so that's why I mentioned it. But we had a pretty good time, and then we went back to his place to drop off the award David won, and change into tacky Christmas sweaters for a party that we had later that night. It was maybe 7:30, but given that it was December, it was already pretty dark out when we pulled into the parking lot outside of David's apartment. At his place there was one road with parking on either side. Spots against the building and spots against a fence that lined the edge of the complex property. We parked in a fenced spot with the trunk of our car facing the building directly across from the stair leading up to David's door. Maybe 30 feet from safety, I would guess. David and I got out though, and we went to the trunk to get his award when a man started to approach us. Dave noticed him and said, "What's up, man?" The man said nothing and just kept walking towards us. As he got closer, I could see that he was wearing baggy black sweatpants and a camo hoodie. He had the hood on, and the drawstrings were pulled tight, so I could only see about half of his face. Both of his hands were in the front of his hoodie pocket though. David said again, "What's up?" This time the man answered, "Get up against the car." Confused, I said, "Wait, what?" The man pulled a gun out of his hoodie pocket. I said, "Get up against the car." David got against the back of the car while the man put the gun against his back. I was in utter shock that this was happening, so I took a step back, now trapped between two cars, a fence and a man holding a gun to my boyfriend. We told David to give him all the money that we had, but we both really only used cards and never had cash on us. Unfortunately, though, while home for Thanksgiving his parents had given him $200 in 20s, all of which went into the hands of our mother. Then he turned to me, pointed the gun at my face, less than a foot away, and said, "Your turn." I was dressed up and only carrying a small clutch purse. I literally only had a phone and lip gloss on me. I stammered out that I didn't have anything while staring at the gun he had pointed at me. He then went back to my boyfriend. At this point I feel my blood start to boil. I was becoming less frightened and more pissed off. Outraged that this man was aggressively stealing from two broke college kids. I mean, how dare he treat other people like this? Couldn't he tell that we were coming from an event, and he was going to ruin our night? I wanted to kick him in the big clunky heel so badly, but thankfully I realized that would probably just piss him off more. So instead I grabbed my phone, keeping my hand in my purse, and tried to dial 911. Unfortunately, my purse was too small to hide any movement, and I was worried if he saw me trying to call for help that he would shoot. So in the end I just kind of stood there staring at the gun being pressed into David's back. Finally he took David's wallet and car keys and threw them in one direction, ran off in the other, hopping the fence separating the apartment complex from a small neighborhood. David and I just kind of stood there in silence for a second, trying to grasp what just happened. We slowly gathered his keys and wallet, and then went inside and called the police, definitely in shock. But this is where the story gets really interesting. The police had an officer patrolling the other side of the apartment complex. It was a group of about 26 buildings. We were in 26, and the cop was over near one, and the police were there because they'd gotten a call from a previous day about the same guy mugging someone over there. The police and the detectives came over and took our story and asked us questions for about an hour. When they left it was still relatively early, maybe like 9 p.m. We were still shaken up, but David and I decided that we'll still go to the tacky Christmas party that we planned on attending, thinking that it would help us take our mind off of this horrible encounter. Our friend was hosting a pre-game at his apartment in the building 3 of the same complex. Even though we decided not to drink that night, we head over after getting into our tacky sweaters. The pre-game got a little bit rowdy, and we heard a loud knock on the door. We open it and see the person who lives next door to our friend. He said, "Hey guys, you might want to keep it down. I don't want anyone getting in trouble. I have the police and an investigator at my apartment right now because I was mugged out here last night. I heard 2 people got mugged tonight, so please be safe, yeah?" And David and I looked at each other and then back at him. "Oh hi, actually that was us. We're the 2 that were mugged tonight. It's nice to meet you, fellow mugging victim." He laughed and shook our hands. The neighbor and David compared knives that they were now carrying as personal defense weapons before we went back to his place. Later on down the road, David and I had broken up, but the security at the complex was amped up. More lights were installed in the parking lot, and my girlfriend and I moved in. We had to park in the same set of spots where I was held at gunpoint. Probably a stupid way to face your fears, but we didn't have any issues while we lived there, thankfully. In the end though, this guy that mugged us apparently was never caught. I'm a 21-year-old male. It was July 4th of 2019, and I live in Kansas in the USA. At the time I worked as a corrections officer at a maximum security prison on the night shift. The cell house that I was in charge of was the maximum general population, 1 room to a cell, and this is where all the bad guys were held and overall the worst of society were housed here. Before work I was doing the typical American 4th of July thing, grilling, blowing up fireworks, had a beer or 2, having a great time with my now wife and family as well. My wife kept telling me that I needed to just call in sick and take the day without Pat. I said no because, well, we're a little behind on bills. But boy, do I really wish that I'd listened to her now. As the night went on, it came time for us to leave my mum's and for me to go home and get ready for work. I took my wife home and dropped her off, got ready, and I left for work. My wife's car was actually broken, so she was stuck at home for the night. As I drove to work, which was about an hour's drive away, I watched the fireworks going off all around. It was kind of sad as well because I never had to work on the 4th before, but this was a first. But after I got to work and got all my equipment, I got into my cell house. Business as usual, inmates were showered and mopped up. I got my night cleaning crew out so they could clean the cell house and met up with my partner for the night in the officer station to get our briefing from the last shift. Fast forward an hour into our shift. It's now right around 12:30. Another officer came into the cell house, so now there's 3 of us. This happened often on night shift as there was nothing to do except rounds every half an hour or so, when out of nowhere we hear an inmate laughing like a witch, like a cackle. That was strange, but nothing to be alarmed with. Drugs were a huge problem in this facility, still is in fact as far as I know, but eventually after a few more cackles I decided to go and see what was making the sound in case they were high or something. I walked through and checked all 200 inmates and nothing. There were a small few that were even awake, so I just kind of brushed it off, and I just went back to my office. My partner and the other officer were asking if there was anyone that needed their cell searched. I couldn't think of anyone in particular that I suspected of having anything, so I went and checked all the cells again to see if I could get a whiff of smoke or see something. As I was walking on the 2nd-story cell run, I found an inmate that was acting really weird. He was in his bed facing the wall just talking. This was kind of common too, as there are a lot inmates with minor mental health issues. I figured that he must have been high because he turned and looked at me and told me to F off. I was going to leave him alone, but the disrespect made me kind of change my mind, and the time is now 12:40 July 5th. I walked back to the office and tell the other 2 officers which cell that he was in, and I wanted him searched, cell 218. So how the cell house is laid out is there are 100 cells per level, but from the officer station, you can see the north side 1st and 2nd floor, but you can't see the south side unless you walk the 50 feet over it. Picture the movie Shawshank Redemption type cell house, except instead of being able to look through and see the cells across, you just see a wall. The cells are literally back to back. So as the officers go to pull him out of his cell to search it, I went to the ground floor and was watching from below. Reason why? I wanted to get the inmate on the ground level and not the 2nd floor. All that was there for protection from going over the edge was a handrail. I noticed the inmate was taking forever to get out of his cell. He came out in shorts and a do-rag, which was weird because he wasn't fully clothed, didn't even put on sandals. Just shorts and a do-rag, yet took 5 minutes to get out, and that made me really nervous. The inmate was a 6-foot-tall, 250-pound muscle-bound dude too. Definitely had size on us. So from the ground I holler at him and tell him to come down to the ground, and that he could use the phone or check his email or commissary or something, and he declined my offer, which never happens. I knew something was up at that point. He was watching them search his cell from the control panel box, and this was alarming. They were in his cell, and I was on the ground. He could have easily ambushed them, and he would have made it to them before I could get up the stairs. So to try and keep them safe, I went upstairs to the inmate. He was standing in the corner away against the handrails at the top of the stairs. He knew that I was the OIC officer in charge of that cell house, and he knew that I was the one that saw him talking to himself, and he asked me why I was having his cell searched. I lied, and I said, "Oh, it's nothing personal, man. I have a quota that I have to fill for cells searched in a night, and you're awake, so I just chose you to have it searched. It'll just take a second, don't worry." He was uneasy, he was pacing, something just wasn't right, and then I saw it. He had turned just right, and I saw in his do-rag the Samsung logo reflecting the cell house light. Shit! I knew that there was going to be a problem as soon as I saw it, because he had a cell phone. I called over the radio for 2 additional officers to come to me. The inmate didn't seem to notice that I made the call. My supervisors responded saying 2 of them were on their way. Side note too that at this time only segregation officers had protected this. So out of the 5 of us that were now in there, only 1 had a vest, and I was not one of them. The officers there were South, he had a vest, McCormick, Collins, Sheffield, and me. The time is now 12:58, and as soon as South and McCormick got up to me, I told the inmate to turn around and to cuff up. South and McCormick were on the inmate's right side. I was in front of him, and he said why angrily. I refused to give him a reason at first, and after a few minutes I had had enough. So I told him, "Look man, I can see the cell phone in your do-rag. You know you're not supposed to have that." The inmate then gets a defeated look on his face, but then fire in his eyes. His body relaxes, and he slowly reaches up to retrieve the phone, but does he pull out a phone? No, he pulls out a 6-inch sharpened metal rod with ripped fabric wrapped around the bottom of the handle. Everything froze for me. I knew right then that I was about to die. Everything starts moving again, and I now have an inmate twice my size charging and thrusting quickly and repeatedly towards me. I immediately went into defensive mode, trying to grab his arm and disarm him. His wrist kept slipping, and I couldn't keep a hold of it, but at the very least I thankfully managed to block his attempts at my lower abdomen. Suddenly, though, he aimed high and went for my chest. I felt it make contact too, and I'd just been stabbed in the right part of my chest. I yelled, "Spray him," at the top of my lungs. McCormick was already working on it. For those who don't understand, 9 Malawian kwaches comes as a pressured spray bottle, about 20 ounces I think, and you can buy it at a camping store in the US, and it's called bear spray. It's the stuff that you spray in bears' eyes so that you can get away. South had come up behind the inmate and grabbed him around his chest and pulled him backwards right as McCormick sprayed. I didn't realize it at the time, but the spray actually hit me, the inmate and South, as well as everyone near us. I was able to turn and run, and I ran around the stair railing past the panel box and out onto the run of the cells in the 2nd story. I ran past a few cells and turned around to see that he wasn't chasing me, but South was wrestling him onto the ground while gagging on the OC, as was I and McCormick. Sheffield, having heard the commotion, came running out of the cell, saw what was happening, and ran in to help. The inmate, though, grabbed South by the vest and tried to throw him over the end of the landing, but South dropped to his knees before he went over. I grabbed my shoulder mic, and I screamed into it a level A response to Charlie Now. The dispatch said something back, but I didn't hear it. I started to charge back to help save South, but before I could get away from the cell I was in front of Collins, and he grabbed me from behind and told me to not go. Due to the layout of the runs I didn't see, but Sheffield grabbed the inmate from behind and body slammed him on his face, and thankfully he began to cuff him. Sheffield got covered in OC as well due to the inmate being covered in it, and as soon as Collins let me go I stood still and I watched. Up the stairs came 4 officers, the captain and a lieutenant. The lieutenant came and asked me what happened, and I started to explain, but he cut me off after he saw blood coming out of my left arm. After taking me out of the cell house, he made me lift my shirt because he saw the blood. He examined all my wounds, and he had to remove all of my equipment and old paper towels to my arm. I was rushed to the ER, and I was able to grab my phone out of my rental car. I had actually totaled my car a few weeks prior by hitting a deer. I called my wife, and I told her what happened, and she called my parents and siblings. Luckily, my injuries weren't too bad. I was stabbed 4 times, once on my left arm, just below the elbow. That was through and through. Blade went into one side and out the other, twice at the top of my left hand, and the one that hit my chest went into my skin, but hit one of my ribs, keeping it out of my lungs thankfully. And after 37 plunges, I think it's safe to say that I'm lucky to be here to even write this story. I didn't sleep for 2 days following the event, and I still have nightmares almost daily about it. I'm always paranoid, and I openly carry a gun. After my attack, I was forced to resign for safety reasons. Everyone statewide that works in max prisons now has vests, and none of the people from there talk to me anymore. I must say that I really feel abandoned. I have one guy from that facility that I still see, and my sergeant who wasn't there that night. Court is coming soon to add 3 more attempted murders on this guy, and it turns out that he was a shot caller for the Crips gang. Anyway, stay safe out there everyone, and if any law enforcement listens to this, always watch your six, and never be afraid to ask for backup. So I've heard some stories recently about human trafficking, and it got me thinking about this experience that I had last summer. So I, 18, female, 17 at the time, went to the convenience store near my house to get a Slurpee at around 9 or 10 p.m. I was walking up to the doors, and I noticed 3 middle-aged men standing near the doors just kind of talking. There was an older lady struggling to open the door to leave, so as I came in I opened it for her. As I walked into the store she stopped and said thank you and blah blah blah, but this is when it started to get really weird. So she asked me how old I was and what school I went to, then she asked me where I lived. I replied with, "Oh, I live in this town," but she was insistent on knowing where my house was. I started to get creeped out, so I pretended to get a call from my boyfriend, which I didn't have, and answered like, "Oh hey babe, I'm just at Circle K near my house, and I'll be over in 15. After I answered the call, she hurried out of the store and went up to those 3 men that were standing by the entrance. I got my Slurpee, and then I literally ran to my car. I looked out of my window, and the 3 men and the old lady got into a vehicle. I unfortunately can't remember what the make was and started driving in my direction. Well, I noped the hell out of that parking lot, and I drove away. I drove a bit down the road, and then I noticed that they were definitely following me, so I turned into the Walmart parking lot, and they continued forward. I'm hoping that it was just a coincidence that they were going in the same direction that I was. The whole situation felt really off and really creepy. The fact that they followed me and only went past me after I stopped, and they kind of knew that I knew that they were following me, really creeps me out. This all happened about 7.5 years ago, I think when I was 13. My grandmother was in the hospital in pneumonia, and by the time that my family got there, there was about 11 or 15 of us. Yeah, it's a lot, but 5 out of the 8 children were with their families. After a little while though, they told us that we needed to leave, so they could give her some shots and whatnot. At the time we didn't know that there was a waiting room on the floor, so my uncle suggested that we go down to the first floor, so we could sit in the waiting room, or whatever it was. We had to go down 2 separate elevators since there were so many of us, and once we got down there we saw 2 nurses hiding behind a door, and when we asked what was wrong they said nothing, you can still go in there. So we walked in. It was about 2 p.m. on a Sunday, there was no one in there, and the lights were off, and yes, in retrospect we should have just turned around and walked back out, but like all white people in horror movies, I suppose we didn't think anything of it. We met up with the rest of the family, and that's when we noticed 2 other guys. The first man was sitting with his hands behind his back, the second one was standing behind him, holding his wrists together. The man sitting was staring daggers right at me, and after about 10 minutes of sitting and staring, a third man in a hospital security uniform came up and asked if we saw anything. Visibly confused, we said no, and they told us that we needed to leave. We went back to the 4th floor and found the waiting room, and it was right next to the psych ward with a sign that said "Stay clear, there's a high chance of flight risk." Now you might be thinking, what's so scary about that a random guy was staring at a 13-year-old girl, haha. Well, a little while later we found out exactly what happened. The man that was sitting on his hands restrained was a junkie looking for a quick fix. He had walked in and was told that he couldn't get any drugs without a medical reason, so he pulled out a knife and stabbed the woman at the reception in the neck. Why we were allowed in that room with this man while the hospital was supposedly in lockdown, I'll never understand. I also have no clue where the police were in this whole situation, but this story does kind of have a happy ending for the woman at least. About 2 years ago this incident was brought up at a family gathering, and my cousin said that the woman, she actually survived. She no longer works for the hospital and has a lot of difficulties resulting from her injury, but she was working as a secretary for a school or something. Anyway, it was a really strange experience, and one thing I'll never forget, those eyes that honestly were shooting daggers at. So this happened to me last week on Sunday evening. Every Friday I go to see my boyfriend, who doesn't live in the same city as me, but in the city next to me. It takes an hour by car to get to his place, and I don't have a driver's license because I live in a big city, and I don't need a car to go to my university or my job. I just use the subway. Now you have to know that it's been really difficult to travel by train in France right now because of all the strikes and whatnot, so a lot of people just travel next to carpool. We have a very famous app to travel like this. It costs less, and it's easier to travel as well, so most people use it. I've used this app for almost a year and a half now, and I've never really had any problems. Last Sunday I go into the app to book a carpool with a woman in her late 40s. I would rather travel with a woman because I'm a girl. I'm 21 years old, and I think it's safer to take a car with a woman, but this time it definitely wasn't. So I booked my carpool, and she wrote me her personal number. When you book a carpool, the person who posted the ad has access to your phone number if they accept your request to let me know that you would come and pick me up at 6:20 p.m. So I go to the meeting place, and I'm getting in her car. I immediately notice that she's acting a little bit strange, but I didn't pay it too much attention. As I said, it's only an hour by car to get myself home. What could happen to me? There were no other passengers too, so I was feeling pretty comfortable. So I'm scrolling on my phone, and I wasn't watching the road. When you take the carpool, the principle is that the driver takes the highway and does not leave it until we arrive to the destination. Nobody ever gets off the highway, and it's really weird if someone does that because it's the person who booked the carpool who paid for the toll and whatnot. So there's really no reason to not do it. 30 minutes later though, and I notice that we're already at the toll, and I start to watch all over, but didn't recognize the toll of my city. I realized then that she got off long before the freeway exits that she was supposed to take. I don't know why, but my survival instinct was pretty much immediately awoken. I took a screenshot of the conversation that I had with her earlier in the day with her phone number and sent it to my boyfriend and my half-sister, telling them that if I'm not replying and if they don't have any news for me in an hour, to call the cops. I also turned on my GPS just in case. Then I asked her what she was doing. "Excuse me, why are you leaving the highway? We're not in the right place." And she started to act stranger than before. "Yes, I know. I just want to visit this village with you." "What? Why?" "I don't want to go there. I've paid you to drive me to my city. I'm not here to visit anyone with you. Can you please just drive me to my destination?" She started to leave the road. Don't be afraid," she replied. "I just want to spend some time with you." "What?" "I'm not here to spend time with you. There are less than 500 people who live here. There's nothing to do here. Please, just take me to my destination." She said that she takes this road because there's too much traffic elsewhere. I text my boyfriend what she just said to me. He goes on the traffic website and told me that there's absolutely no traffic where I was supposed to go, which means that she's definitely lying. My heart starts to beat faster, and then I decide to pressure her. I have no idea how it came in my mind, but this is what I told her. "Listen, lady, you will drive me where you're supposed to, all right? I warn my boyfriend and my sister that you're acting weird. They know where I am, and furthermore, my father is working for Interpol. That's International Criminal Police Organization. I'm about to text him if you don't take me where I'm supposed to go, and let me tell you that he will definitely find me." She immediately starts to become really anxious and starts to insult me, but she went back to the hype. She didn't know that what I said wasn't totally true. My father really was working for Interpol for more than 10 years, but he actually quit his job when I was about 4 or 5 to go start a new life in another country with my mother, brother, and me as well, after my mother left him because we was violent. He actually left us behind, and I don't talk to him anymore. He's a really toxic person. A good cop, but a really bad person. Violent, alcoholic, a liar, but that's another story for another time. Anyway, she drives me to my destination and asks me to get out of the car right after we pass the top. I didn't want to spend any more time with her, and I was glad to be safe. I got home safely eventually, and I immediately contacted the application support service, and they wrote me back, thanked me for warning them, and a few days later, they sent me another email telling me that they're sorry and that they're going to erase her profile. Well, I know that nothing happened to me in the end, which I'm grateful for, believe me, but it was a really creepy situation. I don't know where she was taking me and what she was planning to do, and I'm really glad that I came up with the line that I did to get out of that situation. Although my father will never know, he maybe saved me that day. So, I, a 20-year-old female, lived in a really shady as hell apartment complex in an otherwise rich suburban area for 3 years, and have a lot of stories that would fit here, believe me, but this one is about a neighbor that I call Bob. So me, 18 at the time, and my then 16-year-old sister used to babysit all the neighborhood kids. These kids considered us their friends, and it got to where they seemed to have a sort of radar of when me and my sister were outside. They'd come out and talk to us, and we'd let them ride our skateboards and such in the parking lot. The kids were ages about 8 to 13, I would guess. So one day we were outside with them, and we were joined by a stranger. He stood between us and our car, towering over us. He introduced himself and asked us to sign a petition that he made. We did, just being friendly. Then he asked us how old we were. I thought maybe he was a fellow teenager that looked older, or that maybe he was just being awkward. So, I told him that I was 18, and the very next question was if I wanted to go out with him. It was in front of my mom, and the other kid's mom too. I awkwardly declined, but he continued talking about how he thought me and my sister were in middle school. Also, he was apparently 28. Eventually, though, he wandered away to ask someone else to sign his petition. A few days later, he knocked on our door after asking a neighbor for the address. He had a bag of what he said was chicken, and wanted us to go and eat it with him at the park or something. We declined because we both had schoolwork to do, and he walked away, and he was mumbling about how antisocial everyone was. Later, we look out our window and see him playing baseball with two girls. He kept physically moving their arms to different positions, even though they shrugged him away from them. The next day, one of the kids runs up to me, and I'll call her Maddie. She's 8. She's got a new pair of Heelys, and wanted help with them. I was holding her hand and guiding her along when Bob appears and says that he can help better. Maddie says no, but he insists. He pushed me aside and reaches for Maddie, holding her tightly around the upper chest area. The grandma was there too and flips out, and he eventually wanders off. The next day, Maddie is freaking out saying Bob was just sitting on her porch when she left for school that morning. Her parents found out, and as they walked outside, he just let himself in, and they said that he went to their kitchen to make orange chicken. We later found out another neighbor had a similar story as well. Another time, we were helping a family move. They have a 2-year-old son. The garages are in a triangle shape to the road, almost sort of like a roundabout. There's a flat patch of grass behind them, and well, here comes Bob to help us. He criticized the way that we packed things and didn't help until our neighbor politely asked him to leave. He left the garage, but instead of leaving, he asked the 2-year-old if he wanted to play. The kid said no, and that made him mad apparently. He picked up the kid to play, and the kid eventually slapped him. He asked the kid again if he wanted to go behind the garages to play ball, and the kid's mom doesn't notice, so I go with them and guide the kid to his mom. But the climax of this story is when me and my sister went on a walk with our 17-year-old friend and her other friend. Maddie found us too, and wanted to come along as well. So we're starting out when Bob comes out. He sees our friend and asks how old she is and how much she weighs because she's so skinny. He asks where we're going, and my friend tells him that we're going for ice cream on a girls' trip. We didn't ask her to say that. He's like, oh man, and sort of stomps away. We continue our walk, but halfway through we have a really weird feeling. I look behind us and Bob is running towards us. He yells at us for hiding from him, while also telling Maddie about how pretty she is. An older neighbor sees this and asks him what's going on. He tells the man that we're being mean, and he needs to go write a song about us. He leaves, but we see him sitting at the park, and well, he saw us, and again comes running. We stop and he asks which one of us is over 18. Maddie's dad is here at this point, and tells him that we aren't interested in him. He explodes at this point, telling the dad to fuck himself, and that he's so rude. Then he called me a bitch. Maddie's crying, and the neighbor who saw us before came to check on us, since he saw Bob running, and Bob eventually goes inside muttering to himself again. For weeks we actually don't see him. A single dad and his 5-year-old daughter moved in, and we're introducing ourselves to them, and my mom kind of tips him off that there's someone in their building who's a little off, especially around Maddie. The dad says that he's seen someone like that giving kids candy at the pool, and the kids looked uncomfortable. Well, here comes Bob as if on cue. He immediately tells the girl in front of her dad too, that she looks like a movie star, and that she's so pretty. He asks to play with her, but the dad says no, and they go inside. Turns out they were next-door neighbors, which was very unfortunate for them. We still didn't see him much after that, but other neighbors were telling us stories about him. There's a woman who's alone most of the day with her 2 kids under 5 who told us that he watches her when she goes to and from her car. Also, Maddie's parents continue to see him watching her as well, and then one day we're again just babysitting, and here he comes again. Only this time he's swinging nunchucks around. Maddie screams and hides in our car. Bob strolls over with his nunchucks and starts talking to us all casually. Then his head cranes to look into the car, and he says, "Where's Maddie?" We told him that she wasn't here, and he walks away. By then most of the kids were afraid to go outside when they saw him. He had a habit of wandering around the complex, but we could tell by his height and lanky gait as well when he was coming. A few times we'd seen Bob with his dad, and those times neither of them even glanced at us. And one day, he just sort of stopped showing up. We'd see his dad and brother come in and out all the time, but we never saw him. We only saw him again maybe a year later, and it was only for one day near Christmas, and then he disappeared again. So I don't really know what happened to him, but it was just one of our weird experiences with the neighborhood and the 3 years that we lived. Maybe I'll share some other stories about some chick that tried to kill her parents because she was a witch, or the old man that bites children next if you'd like to hear them, but this story is definitely one of the ones that made me feel the most ickiest, and it was creepy. I was about 6 years old, and we had gone to a karate tournament for my older brother and father. The whole place had people from this karate club everywhere, and everyone in the club knew me, as it was a pretty close-knit group. Also, this was back in the more free-range days of parenting, so I was left at one of the competitions to watch some of the people from our club compete. There was a little girl there who started to be mean to me, but her mother called her over, and soon she was sort of being sickly sweet to me, and brought me to her mother to meet her. They said that they were there to watch her brother as well, but the brother was nowhere to be seen, and they didn't seem to know anyone there, which was weird. But after a while the competition finished, and I got up saying that I had to go and find my parents. The woman then said, "Oh no, you should come and watch my son compete." She grabbed me by the wrist and started to take me with them. I told her that she was hurting my wrist, and she said that it was because she had to hold me tight since it was so crowded in there. I insisted that I needed to see my parents, and she said that she would take me to them. She began to walk towards the door to take us outside and into the parking lot when my father, thank God, stopped us. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded. The woman became very indignant. "I'm taking her to her parents, they're friends of mine." My father then responded, "I'm her parent." My father was in total shock, and the woman just took off out the door before he even knew what was happening. We called the police, but nothing ever really came from it, and we never saw that woman again, and thankfully I wasn't kidnapped that day. Years ago, when I was just becoming a teenager, my mom's half-sister, my aunt, her husband, my uncle, and their 5-year-old daughter, my cousin, had moved into my aunt's mom's house due to financial issues. My aunt's mom was dating someone at the time, so she had moved out and allowed my aunt, uncle, and cousin to move in with no problems. The house was small and kind of creepy, but it was big enough to house their family, and it was a very short distance from my house, so we got to see them quite often. However, the place was creepy, as I said. Something about it just gave younger me the chills any time that I stepped foot in there. The upstairs didn't have much access to natural light, but it was the only area with the bedrooms for my cousin, so she had her bedroom and a playroom on the second floor. The first floor was very long, but not very wide, so you basically passed through every room to either get to the living room, the sunroom, or my aunt's and uncle's bedroom on the other side of the house. But the basement? The basement was terrifying. It was extremely dark and often very musty. It had one little window, and then only one measly little light to illuminate the area. Supposedly, too, there was a cat down there that they kept and fed, although I never actually saw said cat. Knowing a general layout of the house is important for this story, though, and you'll understand why in a minute. So what I was unaware of, though, is that the house was originally owned by a lady that was a caretaker of sick young kids with Down syndrome. Don't ask me how, or why she took up that role, but she did, and of course oftentimes if the kids couldn't shake the sickness, they would sometimes die in the house. There was never a clear record to my understanding, but it was confirmed that at least 3 kids had passed away due to illness in this home. This didn't pose as a problem to my aunt and uncle, though, and they lived there for a couple of months with no issues. Until one day, when just all hell broke loose. So my aunt and uncle enjoyed watching paranormal shows, even if they were seemingly completely fake. They just enjoyed seeing people venture into the unknown. However, I and my family believe now that it may have opened a portal of sorts in the house for some sort of restless spirit or something. Now, one afternoon my cousin was home schooled her whole life. My aunt was watching TV, and my cousin was behind the couch in an open area between the sunroom and the living room playing with some of her toys and a little soccer ball, when all of a sudden she exclaimed, "Hey, give me back my ball." Knowing that there was nobody else in the house at the time, my aunt looked over the couch to my cousin and questioned who she was talking to. What my cousin said next gives me cold chills every time I think about it. Take into consideration, too, that she's young, and she's unaware of the previous history of the house. She responded to my aunt, though, that boy, he took my ball. To which my aunt asked what boy, and my cousin responded, that little boy sitting there, don't you see him? He has a weird-looking face. Immediately my aunt knew what she was referring to. This boy with this weird face could probably only be described as one of the kids with Down syndrome that had passed away in this house. Terrified of the situation that she was in now, my aunt calmly told my cousin it's okay, just be nice to him, and politely ask for your ball back if you're going to play with it. She told my uncle when he came home from work that night, and they definitely became a little bit uneasy of the fact that there were possibly restless spirits appearing to my cousin. A little time passed, though, and no other new encounter seemed to be occurring, or at least my cousin wasn't vocal about them anyway. So out of curiosity, one day my aunt asked my cousin what happened to that little boy, and I kid you not, my cousin very nonchalantly said him, and 2 of his friends visit me every night after you and Daddy put me to bed. They get mad and tell me to stop talking about them. I tried hiding from them, but they just stand and stare until I go to sleep. Now, of course, my aunt is terrified these things are suppressing my cousin from even speaking about them now. So my aunt asks, do his friends look weird like he does? To which my cousin replied, yeah, but I'm not allowed to talk about them, Mummy. Needless to say, after my aunt told my uncle about this interaction, they became very proactive about finding another place to live due to just feet. But these spirits had one more encounter planned, and they were eager to show their dissatisfaction, apparently with my aunt and uncle's choice to remove their playmate from their home. So it was late one night. My aunt's mom had a Harley Davidson that she stored in the basement of the house, but she had taken it earlier that day and rode it to her boyfriend's house. At around 1 a.m. that night, my aunt thought that she heard the motorcycle downstairs, which was odd seeing that it was obviously so late that there was no way that her mom would be bringing home the bike or anything. But it continued, and the sound didn't go away. Finally, she woke up my uncle, and they called her mom. When her mom answered, they asked her if she was in the basement with her motorcycle, and she was very puzzled as she was still in another county over with her boyfriend. So they ended their call, and my aunt and uncle went to investigate. And no sooner that they reached that little door that led to the basement, which was deadbolt by the way, cold chills just shot down their spines. They both swore that they heard whispers coming from the door. Terrified but in need of answers, they slowly crept over closer to the door, and then it began violently jolting, nearly breaking the deadbolt off the wall. They jumped back and ran and grabbed my cousin and drove to my papa's house, my aunt and my mum's dad, and stayed there the rest of the night. Soon after that they moved to another state, and we still stay in touch today. The house is currently up for auction, and man, do I pity the person who purchases it. My aunt and uncle will not get involved with anything close to the paranormal anymore, and my cousin doesn't remember anything, but it was a strange house for sure. I remember very vividly when there were 2 of the same people in the same house. In the middle of the day, when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I think, I was leaving the living room to go to my room. I saw my dad leaving the kitchen on the other side, going the same direction as me down the hall, and he was just ahead of me. My parents' room was down the hall, just like mine, right next door. I assumed he was going into his room and didn't think anything of it. He didn't say anything, didn't see his face, just assumed that he was going to take a nap or something, and instead of walking straight into his room, he turned left where the only way he could go was into my room. I assumed that he was looking for me, again didn't think much of it, I was right behind him, but when I turned into my room after him, he was just gone. But I saw him though, clear as day, as solid as me. It definitely wasn't something in my peripheral or a shadow, but that was my dad. Obviously I got scared. I ran into the den where he was last at, but there he was, falling asleep to the football game. I woke him and asked if he'd been in my room, and he said no, of course. But if he had been in my room like I saw, then he'd have needed to turn back down the hall, pass me and go through the kitchen again to get to the den. This always stuck with me for 2 reasons as well. One, because I couldn't quite explain how there could have been 2 of the same person in the same house. And 2, because of the fact that I never actually saw his face, and it just kind of gave me a sinking feeling. 15 years later, and I still try to think of the possibilities. My first thought is that maybe it was something paranormal, as there were a few strange occurrences in that house. But I also think about the power source in the driveway. There was a big square vented area in our driveway, which I later learned was something from the energy company to power the entire neighborhood, and maybe that had something to do with it. Maybe the house somehow recorded a memory and replayed it or something. I don't know, I'm clutching at straws here. It's probably not related to, but my dad, myself, and my sister, half of my family all dream of our old home often. We dream that we're in it as if we truly are, and it's never been like that for any other home. My dad has the most vivid ones too, where he actually knows a new family is there, and they can tell that somebody is in the house. We often joke that we haunt the house in our sleep, in fact. But I know that this isn't the first time that my dad has been involved in something like this. Across the country in a different house years ago, my mom experienced hearing him come home. Same exact routine that he's always had, just early. But when she called out for him and he didn't answer, she was so convinced that she'd heard someone come in, same keys, same footsteps, everything, that she actually searched the house with a weapon, terrified. I don't know if it's something to do with the house, or something with my dad, or some sort of a glitch in the Matrix. I don't know, but I really would like to find out. This story is from a while back, before I moved into my current home. In 2016, my mom and I moved into a very old home. Over the few years that we lived there, we had quite a few experiences, but the most notable for me personally was the incident of where I came face to face with the burned man upstairs. So it was a weeknight, and I had school the next day. At around midnight, I went to bed, which was a bit early for me at that time. A few hours later, I woke up just drenched in sweat, and my fan was turned off. Annoyed, I rolled over to turn it back on, and looked up at my door, noticing that it was open. And then the door opened a bit more, and a strange-looking nude man was standing before me. He seemed abnormally tall, I'd say at least 6 feet 8 inches plus. His head was nearly touching the door frame for reference, and his skin just appeared off, similar to skin grafts that burned victims receive. It appeared visibly tacky and definitely wasn't very pleasant to look at, but its face was even worse. The skin on its mouth seemed to have been drawn back, exposing the gums fully, and one eye seemed far too small and the other far too large. Whatever it was, it just stood there in the doorway looking at me. It smiled after it made eye contact with me, and to this day I can't tell you why I responded this way. But I get grumpy when I first wake up, and this was no exception. So I told this thing to get lost, and I rolled over and fell back to sleep. I did this after turning my fan back on, of course. That morning my door was still open, but nothing was there, and I went full panic mode and refused to sleep up there for weeks after it finally set in what I actually saw, which didn't help much. I have more stories from that house too, if anyone's interested. But some things to consider is that this home was actually once a funeral home, which had a fire a long time ago. I'm not sure if anyone was hurt or killed in this fire or not, but I always sleep with my door closed as well, and I remembered closing my door that night. It was a bit finicky, however, as there was no lock, and due to the house shifting, if you stepped on a certain floorboard it would pop open, but I'm pretty sure that I would have noticed that. Also, at no point did I feel threatened during this encounter despite its strange appearance. I'm not a hard ass by any means, and I have a respectful fear of the paranormal for sure. Out of the other experiences in this house, this was the one time that I didn't feel scared or creeped out by a paranormal event, which is really strange because if anything should have scared me, it was probably that. I never talked about it the first time it happened as well, and nobody, but my mom knew about it until now. My mom's friend and their little boy moved in as well, and despite nobody telling him about what I saw, he would wake up screaming in the dead of night about the tall man with the weird face, which only served to confirm everything that happened to me. So I'll preface this story by saying that I live in a small town in the Midwest of about maybe 300 people, basically in the middle of nowhere. I can remember my mother telling a story too, when I was younger, that has stuck with me since. My father was an over-the-road truck driver, so he wasn't around much. That left my mother to pretty much raise my little brother, little sister, and me on her own. One night she was awoken by a bright light shining through her bedroom window. She said that it was as if someone had parked their car and directly turned their bright headlights on pointed toward her bedroom window. Her first instinct was to get up and check on us kids. She had noticed though that the bright light wasn't confined to her bedroom, as it was shining through every window in our house pretty much, and she saw that I was accounted for, as was my little sister, but she couldn't find my little brother, who was about 3 at the time. She was scouring the house and finally sees him in our laundry room, opening the back door that leads to our backyard, and as soon as he opens the door the brilliant light shines in, and then she just remembers waking up. She's accepting this as all just a bit of a weird dream when her eyes begin to focus on the dark of her bedroom, and she sees a small figure at the foot of her bed. As she sits up to see what exactly it is, it scampers off into the darkness of her house, and then she wakes up again. It's a dream in a dream, she keeps telling herself that anyway, and later that day she's hanging up the laundry and conversing with our neighbor woman, who asks her a question. Hey, I know that this is going to sound like a really strange question, but did you guys have party lights on last night or something? I know why. My mother replies. Our neighbor goes on to tell her that she and her husband had a disagreement the day before, and she decided to sleep in her son's room, and at about 3 a.m., she was woken up by a bright light emanating from around our house. Fast forward to a few years ago, and I own our old house, and have children on my own, and to preface this next story, I should mention too that our house is set overlooking the town cemetery. Now one evening after returning home, I'm carrying my youngest son into the house. I thought that he was asleep when all of a sudden he starts wailing and screaming while pointing across the graveyard. Daddy, get inside, they're coming after us, they're going to take us, the green skeleton men are going to take us. So this obviously freaks me out a bit, and I try to turn and see if there's anything that he's actually seen. I don't see anything, but he just continues losing it. Once inside, he's still hysterical, wants me to lock the door and shut the shades. He absolutely refused to let me go out and get the groceries, and it was bizarre to say the least. Later that week there's another spell. It's about 2 a.m. when I hear him crying and yelling for me. I rush into his room, and he's crying, begging me not to let them take me again. I kind of write this off as a nightmare, but I ask him where they are trying to take him, and he replies with where the bad Power Rangers are. I proceed to ask him where the bad Power Rangers are, and he replies a spaceship. Now I don't know if it was just the imagination of a 4-year-old, or if it was his mind trying to rationalize an actual traumatizing event, but I can't help but assume the two are connected, and it's the worst feeling in the world, trying to protect your child from a monster that you don't even know may exist. Fast forward again, though, to this week. I started a paranormal conspiracy podcast earlier this year, where we talk about creepy stuff and have listeners call in, and some experiences, and such. And well, I got this email this week from the son of our neighbor that saw the light over our house that night. This is what it says: the incident involving AJ, and I went like this. I know it was the early 90s because I was in my 70 Chevelle somewhere between St. Mary's Church and where our shop is now. I was driving us home around 9 at night, no other traffic anywhere here. Shortly before the highway curves left, the most intense bright white light appeared out of nowhere. It was like a flashlight being held against my eyes. Oddly enough, as blinding as it was, I could make out the outline of what I assumed was a man about my height. The first instinct was to jam on the brakes, and as soon as I did, the light was just gone. The car had died, and all the lights inside and outside weren't functioning. After a few seconds, the lights came on, and the car started again. AJ wouldn't even answer me when I asked him what we hit. No damage, and I couldn't find anything anywhere. I drove to Mom and Dad's, and AJ begged me to not get out of the car. He never mentioned it on the highway, but now insisted that I stay in the car. I went in and got Mom, and told her everything. She went to talk to AJ, and he told the same story, but refused to exit the car. He told her that whatever we saw was still hiding under the car somewhere, and my wife's question was, did this happen around the same time as the lights at your mom's house? And that was the end of the email. His incident took place no more than a mile or so from our house, and possibly the same or similar time as to the lights over the house incident, which is really weird, and so I can't help but think that they're all related, and I wonder about how our small town may have piqued something's interest so much like that. Do you guys have any idea about what might be going on here? So the year is 2007. I'm 9 years old, and my brother is 7. Our parents are out working. Our grandmother is out buying groceries, so we're left alone at our 3-story home. We're bored and quite energetic. We decided to play hide and seek. The family house is too big and too old, so we have plenty of space to play around and have fun, and after a few rounds of playing, the turn to seek is mine, and my brother has to hide. Counting up to 10 against the wall, I shout out, "Ready, or not, here I come," and begin my search. Despite both of us being somewhat good at choosing difficult and creative places to hide, my brother went for the most obvious spot that I could imagine. On the first floor, behind a curtain, and against a wide window where light reflected his body, his silhouette giving him away at first sight, and his tennis shoes showing at the base of the curtain. Victoriously, I tell him, "Come on, that's a really easy spot, it's your turn to seek." He doesn't move and he doesn't answer, so I get upstairs and wait for him to come, sitting on a sofa against the wall with clear vision of the stairs. After a good 20 minutes or so, though, I see my brother come down from the 3rd floor. Confused, he asks me, "Why didn't you come to seek me?" I stay silent for a moment, and I ask him, "Did you put your runners at the base of the curtain?" He answers firmly no. He tells me that he heard me talking from the 3rd floor and assumed that Grandma arrived home and I was talking to her or something, which definitely was not the case. I tell him that I thought that he was behind the 1st floor curtain and I ask him to come with me to the curtain to investigate. Slowly we descend the stairs one by one, always keeping our backs to the wall and our eyes on the bottom of the stairs. And when the curtain is within our vision, there's no figure there anymore, but the shoes are still there, still at the base. Closing in, I reach out with my hand to the curtain, but there's just air. I keep pulling the enormous curtain to try and feel something, but an earwig falls from it and lands on my shoulder. Scared, I slap it away and step back. Both of us go upstairs quickly, and I tell my brother what I saw. He reaffirms to me that he definitely didn't put the shoes there, and that we should stay put on the sofa until Grandma arrived, so we didn't. Up to this day, I still don't know what I saw back there. Since 3.5 years ago, we moved out of the home because of financial problems, and we never experienced something similar ever again. I always took my brother's word as the truth since the last round. Before he hid, I was the one to hide, and I don't remember seeing the shoes on the first floor when I did. There's no way that he could have gone from his room in the back of the second floor to the first floor, and then the third floor in just 10 seconds without me hearing him run to put the shoes there. Plus, why would he do that? Perhaps my memories are blurry, and perhaps my brother did lie, and somehow pulled it off. I don't know. Or maybe someone or something really manifested then and there. Maybe it just wanted to play with us? Maybe their motives were sinister? I don't know, but whatever it was, I still keep it as a memory from the house that I grew up in, and I still wonder exactly what played hide and seek with us all those years ago. Last summer, me and my brother took a walk through the woods at Silver Falls State Park in Oregon. The forests were beautiful and cool, so we figured why not, and we took a path into the trees. We were pretty far down the path when it happened. Our cabins were far out of view and out of earshot, and we had just turned a corner and began going up the side of a cliff when my brother froze. I asked him what was wrong, and he was near tears, and he told me that he wanted to go back. We jumped back to the cabins, and he told me that he saw a black streak that was the shape of a human with a long nose, a bald head, skinny limbs dashing silently through the trees. I've never seen my brother in this state before. I mean, he was crying and shaking. I've been thinking about it, and could it have been some sort of a cryptid or something? Maybe whatever that was, if it wasn't just my brother's imagination, is what snatches up people in the blink of an eye in missing 411 cases. I don't know. I would love to hear any ideas or similar experiences for sure. Thanks. So about 2 months ago, I got hired to work in a gas station or a convenience store. Same thing to me. It wasn't a hard job, but the challenge was being open 24 hours. I worked the night shift, often alone, starting around 10 p.m. and leaving shortly after 6 a.m. At night, I met a very wide range of people too, passing through or regular customers. Now don't get me wrong, it's a big gas station, and we do have food that we make in the small back kitchen if it isn't already made and packaged to be out, which it usually was. But still, it was a lot of different people. So I start to prepare the breakfast foods from around 3 a.m. because we had a morning rush of people at around 4:30, and every day like clockwork as well. I don't usually get all superstitious about the certain times of night and all that, and preparing breakfast foods this early had become a bit of a routine by this point. I remember this whole night just feeling off. I don't know why, but routine just didn't feel, well, routine. Anyway, I get things ready and prepped for breakfast, seeing as I had no one in the gas station. We kept anything already made or packaged in the freezer, just before all of the cold beverage crates. But this door is completely metal, which a handle is on the outside and a push button inside to get out. This freezer is also isolated in the back, so I'm aware of anything going on outside of it. When you open the door, it's a clear path where it swings open, and it'll stay open for the most part. If it does close, it doesn't close fully, leaving a decent gap open, which was also normal. To actually close it, you have to push on it from the outside or pull it from the inside. And so I'm in this freezer getting what I need, and I see the door move slightly. But in a matter of seconds after turning back to my task, this huge door slams shut, and I mean with a massive force. It was like someone threw their whole body against this door, and I couldn't even slam it that hard if I tried to. I didn't have time to process, and the fact that I jumped so badly, I dropped all of the food before I swung the door open, and I ran out to the open station. My immediate thought was that someone had come in, walked into the back office like with bad intentions or something, and saw that I was in the freezer. When I told my coworker that morning we'd check the cameras that are scattered around the station and match the time that it happened, because we don't have one that points at the freezer door or anything, but she could tell that I wasn't joking because I was quite visibly shaken up. Sure enough, aside from me, the place was completely void of people. I was scared so badly by this that I actually stopped doing night shifts at that location, and have since been transferred to a smaller gas station that closes at midnight. I really can't explain what happened that night, but I haven't been the same about working alone since then. Now, I know that this is a strange one, but I decided to tell this story to see if anyone has any sort of rational explanation. I'm 50, male from Peru, and when I was young my family, 2 sisters, mother and father, used to live in a house in a rural village next door to my uncle. We all slept in the same room, separate beds, and we didn't have electricity. Also, there was only one door to the bedroom and one window, which we kept closed at night. So one night I woke up to the sound of my sister screaming. She was shouting that somebody was in her room and touching her thigh. My dad got up and lit a candle, but there was no one in the room. The doors and the windows were closed, and he said that she must have been dreaming, so we all just went back to bed and went back to sleep. The following night, the same incident again. My sister wakes up screaming, saying that someone was moving their hands slowly up her thigh. Dad lights the candle, and there's no one there. The following night, my other sister, number 2, sleeps in her bed with sister 1. Sister 2 wakes up screaming that someone is touching her thigh. Dad checks the room with a candle again, and again there's nothing. This is when we all start to get a little bit concerned, but my parents think my sisters are just playing a very weird joke. The following night, my mother sleeps in my sister's bed, and my sisters sleep with my dad. In the middle of the night, my mom wakes up screaming that someone was indeed touching her thigh, and now my parents are super freaked out, but once again there was nothing in the room, and the doors and the windows were closed. My dad asks everyone to leave the house and stay with my uncle next door, and he decides to sleep in my sister's bed in the house alone, and this is where things get really weird and really unexplainable to me. So that night we wake up to the sounds of my dad shouting for my uncle to help him. My uncle runs next door, lights a candle, and finds my dad lying on the floor out of breath with red marks on his chest and face, and this was my dad's story about what happened. So he said that he was sleeping when he woke up in the night to find a hand touching his thigh, but he didn't react immediately. He waited and the hand began to move higher and higher up his thigh towards his genitals, and as the hand got very close he grabbed it, and he says that he grabbed onto a really hairy arm, too hairy to human. He held onto the creature as long as he could. He said that it was really large and strong, but it scratched him lightly during the struggle, and he couldn't hold on, but the creature didn't run away or open a door or a window or anything, but there was just silence after that, and I saw the redness on my dad, and I actually believed the story because he's not the type of guy to just make something up like this. I was the only one to never experience anything, and to be honest, I'm kind of thankful. After this incident, my dad and uncle stayed in the house, but the creature, or whatever it was, never came back. We all returned to sleeping in that room eventually, and we never had another issue, but do any of you guys have any idea of what it could have been? The area is not known for monkeys, certainly not large ones anyway, and I don't know how a monkey could have entered the room every night and left with no noise, but that's the most likely explanation that I can think of. I mean, there's just no way to enter the room except through a closed door or a closed locked window, which obviously just makes no sense. So around 10 or 11 this morning, I was about to go for a run, but beforehand, I was just chilling in the kitchen. I'd already been up for a couple of hours at this point, had breakfast, etc., and out of the corner of my eye something caught my attention, and when I looked over at it, it seemed that somebody with long blonde hair just moved out of view of the window. I tried to look around the corner from both windows that I could look out of and saw nothing. I thought nothing of it, could have been my cat or something, but then again it seemed like a different color, and it looked a lot like a head of hair and not a cat. A few minutes later, a couple of my cats were waiting outside a different window, but were looking straight at the corner of the house where I saw this blonde thing move to. I caught the cat's attention, but then they looked right back there, which was strange, but oh well, I just carried on and went for my run. When I got back, my sisters wanted to chat, and they said to me, "Hey, do you know what happened with Dad last night?" I said no, and they proceeded to tell me that something freaked him out a bit considering what happened that morning. They told me that my dad came into their room at around 11 and asked them, "Hey, did you guys bring another girl with?" They'd been out at a music event, and after my sisters said no, my dad went as white as milk apparently. He told them that when my 2 sisters came up the stairs, he saw a third girl follow them up the stairs a few steps behind them. They both went into their separate rooms, and the third girl paused at the top of the stairs, and then proceeded to go into my sister's room. My dad was confused at first, but thought it could have just been one of my sister's friends, as they usually have some over after these events, But no, it was actually nobody, and the weird thing is that this third girl was also blonde like the thing that I saw briefly go past my window this morning. Now, I had not known about what my dad saw, and neither did he know what I saw. My other sister then comes out and says that a few weeks ago she thought that she saw a blonde girl go across the landing at the top of the stairs outside my parents' bedroom, but as she just woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, she just thought that she was being all weird and stuff. Anyway, our family obviously thinks that this is some really spooky stuff, but do you guys have any suggestions on what we might need to do next? When I was probably 13, my family and I were on our way home from a Wednesday night church service. My mom was in the driver's seat, and I was behind her in the back. My 5-year-old brother was in the middle, and my 10-year-old sister was on the other side. We were just down the road from the church, but it was a country road and late, and there was no light, and no one else on the road. We were just coming up to our turn, when all of a sudden a car comes swerving from our turning point. This little car was taking the turn so fast that they came into our lane, and almost even hit us. We swerved as they tried to get into their own lane before we collided, and unfortunately for them they overcorrected, and their car flipped and landed on the driver's side door in the ditch. My mom of course hits the brakes and immediately jumps out of the car to go and help whoever was in the car. She got about 3 steps away from the car and stopped dead in her tracks, but my sister and I are sitting there with our mouths hanging wide open, having no clue what to do. All I could think is, this isn't actually happening to us, right? This kind of stuff only happens in movies. But why isn't my mom going to help the person? It was summer too, so we had all of our windows halfway down, and I heard a person start yelling help from the car, and my mom starts moving again to help him, but for some reason she stops again in the center of the road. Another car flies from behind us, and the guy doesn't hesitate to jump out and run up to the car to help. The man gets to the car and starts prying the passenger door open, so the guy in the car can get out. I see my mom wants to run and help, but it's like she just can't move from that spot. The Good Samaritan that pulled up behind us is able to get the door popped open. The guy from inside crawls out the door and gets into like a frog-like crouching position on top of the car. At this point my mom starts taking shuffle steps back to the car, and when I look back at the guy, he has this crazy look on his face. He looks directly at our car and my mom and launches himself off the top of the car and hits the guy who was helping him. He starts running for our car at the same time that my mom turns and runs for our car, and he must have knew that he couldn't get to our car before my mom did, because he changed directions and moved to the car behind us. My mom jumps in and locks our car doors just as the guy jumps in the empty driver's seat of the car behind us. He slams on the gas before he even has time to close the door and almost hits our car, taking off a second time. Next thing we know, the guy who was just carjacked runs up to my mom's window and starts screaming and knocking on the window. My mom is of course shaken and doesn't want to roll down the window, so she settles for cracking it so we can understand what he's saying. He's yelling, asking us to call 911 because his phone was in the car along with his girlfriend. So of course my mom starts searching for her phone to call, but because she's so frantic from what just happened, she can't seem to find it. So I take a break from keeping my little brother and sister calm, and I dial 911 on my phone and I hand it to her. While she's explaining what happened to the operator, we hear a woman scream down the road. The man that was at our window takes off running, and a few minutes later comes back with a severely scraped up woman in his arms that turned out to be his girlfriend. My mom unlocks the doors at this point, and he sets her in the passenger seat while we wait for the cops. The girlfriend told us that he noticed her while he was speeding off and tried to hit her, but she scratched and punched at him, and while trying to plead with him to stop the car, he kept coming at her though, and finally rolled down the window and just pushed her straight out, going about 60. The cops finally show up and talk to all of us and get our stories and whatnot, and while talking to one of the officers, he told my mom that the man had shot and killed a man behind some apartment complex, and that's why he was driving so fast and trying to get away. When we finally got home, we were all told to just go to bed, but of course I wouldn't be able to sleep that night, so I went downstairs to talk to my mom eventually, and I worked up the courage to ask her why she stopped running to the car when the other guy did it, and she told me that she had such a strong feeling that she should stay in the car with us that it was almost like she could hear it. When she heard him start yelling again, she ran to help again, but just like last time, she got the overwhelming feeling just to not go near the car. To this day, I often wonder what would have happened if my mom hadn't have listened to that feeling. The guy could have easily overpowered her and gotten to our car if she had been any further away, and I shudder to think what would have happened to me and my younger siblings. This is a story that my ex-sister-in-law told me a few years ago. I've known her for 17 years now. At the time I was 14, and it was the first time that she'd ever told me this story. So my sister-in-law moved to Provo, Utah in 2001 from Brazil. She'd only been living here for a little over a year when this took place in November of 2002. As she puts it, she was still getting used to the American culture and customs, and as such was still a little bit naive. She promises that this is something that she'll never do again though, but here's her story in her own words. So it was a snowy night in November back in 2002, and I was driving home late from work one night. I drive slower than most even in the best weather conditions because high speeds give me anxiety. I only take the freeway if I absolutely have to, but I stick with regular as much as just like I was this night. I was taking my time as I drove home in quite the snowstorm. I came to stop, and I noticed a man with crutches walking along the side of the road. I felt bad for him, and I decided to pull over and give him a ride, which of course he accepted. I wasn't scared or nervous at all to offer this stranger a ride, because after all this is Provo, and I'm from Rio de Janeiro. I felt very confident in my street smarts, especially in smaller cities like this. So we started with just small talk, which was pleasant, and that evolved into a lengthy conversation. As the conversation progressed, he began to ask me some questions about myself, including what I did for a living, and I told him I was just working at a local pizza joint at the time and going to school studying English, and in turn asked him what he did for a living and what he was going to do on the side of the road in the middle of a snowstorm like that, and he told me that he'd just been released from prison and was going to his friend's house. When he arrived, he found out his friend no longer lived there, and he was just wandering around because he didn't know where to go. It's important to note too that from the moment that he entered my car, I had a very uneasy feeling and was instantly second-guessing my decision. At one point, he went to grab something out of the bag that he was carrying, and I honestly thought, well, this is how I'm going to die. It ended up being nothing, but I was scared the whole time, even if I wasn't showing it. Now you're probably wondering what his answer was for what he did for a living, right? Well, what he said after I asked this question chilled me to the bone, because he simply told me this: I end people's lives. He then proceeded to give me some very sound advice, and he said, listen to me, you're a good person, but what you did for me today, I don't want you to ever do that again. It's dangerous, there are a lot of bad people out there, and today is your lucky day. With that, he asked me to pull over. The car got out, and we just went our separate ways. I had goosebumps the entire time that she was telling me this story, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and I'm very thankful that she hasn't done that ever again. Back in 2010, I lived in a real diver place with 4 other guys. It was a triplex. The owner had converted it into one house, and the place was honestly just short of being condemned, but we were all in our 20s and wanted a party house, so it really worked for us. We threw so many parties that we just didn't notice a lot of the stuff, and like when the spare bedroom window was smashed, and we assumed one of our drunk friends did it by accident. Anytime food went missing, well, obviously one of our drunk idiot roommates just stole it, even though no one ever fessed up to it, but we also had a ridiculous problem with what we assumed were raccoons. All the damn time we would hear scratching and shuffling up on the roof, and every morning we would go out, and our trash would be just all over the place. Well, after about a year of just random messes, missing food and alcohol, and these eerie scratches, one of my roommates and I were leaving the house at the same time for work. As we step outside, there's a familiar woman in our front yard, and we've seen her a few times just wandering the streets in the neighborhood, but never really paid her any attention. But this time she's wearing one of my t-shirts and going through our trash and tossing things on the ground that she isn't interested in, and my roommate and I just kind of both freeze as we see this woman doing this, and she very slowly looks up at us. Her eyes are totally glazed over, and she stares at us with confusion all over her face. My eyes go wide as I recognize my t-shirt, and I go to open my mouth when she says something that to this day has made me shudder. She says, "Why are you living in my house?" And that was all I could handle. I assure you that I'm not someone that is ever short on words, but this one rendered me entirely speechless. My roommate and I stared at each other eyes wide, got into our cars and drove the hell away from our own home just to get away from that situation. That night when we had all the boys together, we told them what had happened, and we made the decision to finally investigate the roof. Turns out we had a flat roof. It's not generally the kind of thing that you think about, but most roofs are slanted or have angles and whatnot, but not our one. It was just a flat roof, like a 2-story building got cut off in half or something. You just couldn't see the top, because it had this awning thing that's blocked the flat roof from view around it. So for the first time we climbed up there and discovered someone had been living on our roof. Many of our missing things were strewn all over it, and there was a makeshift bed, spare clothing, food, wrappers, water, and even books just all sitting there. We moved out shortly after that, but I've never forgot the look of that lady staring through me and asking what I was doing living in her house. So this started in 2017. The activity in the house started to pick up more than usual that year, so seeing and hearing things just became a part of my day, and I never thought twice about any of it really. One night in September, I went to bed early because I was sick and had plans the next day. Now, I'm not someone who was blessed with the ability to fall asleep instantly. I'm so jealous of those people too. But after about 20 minutes of laying with my eyes closed, I felt the corner of my bed dip down. For context too, my bed was against the wall that my door was on, so the end of my bed stopped right at the door frame, plus I slept facing the wall. I felt the dip move along the edge of my bed, all the way up to my upper back where it stopped for a second. Then it went back to the door. I was a teenager with a horrendously messy room, so I just thought that it was my dad coming in to get something that I borrowed from him, and that he was using the bed to not trip over something. I turned my focus back to sleeping and feel the movement again though. Still convinced that it was my dad struggling to find something, I laid there, but after the third time, I realized something. I never heard my door open. At this, I immediately sat up to find myself alone in my room, with the door obviously still closed. Obviously I was freaked out, but I felt really tired and terrible, so I laid back down and just tried to ignore it when it started moving again. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it did take some time, and the movement stopped, so after a while I just passed out. And for the next year or so, at least once a week, I would feel something jump onto my bed and walk around a little before laying across my legs. Weirdly too, I could even feel the heartbeat of whatever it was. It would only happen while I was trying to fall asleep, but later it started walking around even if I was wide awake on my iPad at night. It would only ever stop if I turned to look at it. With the early behavior plus my mum telling me that she heard scratching from inside of my door at 6 a.m. one morning, we assumed at first that it was a dog. My childhood dogs passed away long ago, so I didn't know whose it could be, but it became an almost nightly routine that I soon found sort of comfort in, I guess. Although there was one night that I woke up to the feeling of a full human laying next to me. The whole side of my bed was dipped down as if somebody was there. My bed is only a twin bed, so trust me, you feel anything and everything on there. But I wasn't scared, and I just went back to sleep assuming that it was my dog. A year later, we moved to a new house as well, and this is where my comfort was replaced with confusion. You see, it became a nightly routine, and what used to be a bit of walking, then laying down and sleeping with me, turned into constant moving. It was no longer the feeling of a larger dog laying across my calves. It was the feeling of my entire legs plus my lower back being pushed into the bed. Some nights, I feel the one dog walking, but more often than not, I now feel multiple smaller things walking around at the same time. Usually one by my head, one behind me, and one at my feet. Or I feel let's say, human for the sake of my sanity. Just imagine someone standing at the end of your bed, putting their hands on either side of your body, and climbing onto the bed on top of you. Yeah, I don't know what that's about, but anyway, that's what it felt like. My dad told me that I should try recording it one night to see if I can see the bed moving, since I seem to be the only one experiencing this. So about a year and a half ago, while I was watching videos before bed, I felt it come up. I was laying on my stomach with my iPad against my headboard, without turning around. I grabbed my phone next to me, and it was still walking, but as soon as I opened the camera, it stopped. So, I waited again, and when I felt it, I hit record and pointed the camera at the end of my bed. It walked for a little bit and stopped again, so I tried to watch the video, but I had so many blankets that you couldn't really see anything, and it just wasn't a good shot. I was going to try again, but after that, it stopped for the night. I didn't sleep for 3 days starting that night, too. I was waking up every 45 minutes sort of panicked, and I mean like heavy breathing, almost crying panicked. I feared falling asleep, and every time I woke up, I would turn on my flashlight and stare at my closet. Yeah, closets are creepy, but I was terrified of it for some reason, and I have no idea why. So the next 2 nights, I stayed up as late as I could. The little bit of sleep that I did get would be during the lighter hours of the early morning. The 4th night, I was completely fine, which was a relief. I slept perfectly too, and had no worries about the closet, and I was alone in my bed those 3 nights. I've slept with the lights on almost every night since then, and aside from the dog turning into a human, whatever that is, and the multiple smaller things, this was what really made me think, okay, so maybe the dog assumption wasn't correct. I'm not entirely sure if it was related, but I'm also not counting on it, so 2 weeks later, I woke up in the middle of the night. Now, when I was a kid, I had a weird thing where at least once every couple of weeks, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, hallucinate bugs everywhere around me, and throw myself out of the bed, and this was my first time doing it again in like years. But the weird thing was that morning, I woke up with a giant bruise on my inner leg. I know that I didn't hit anything that night, because there was literally nothing for me to hit besides the floor, and it's difficult to get me to bruise badly in the first place. Like, I'm super clumsy, I admit, and even hitting table corners and really hard, too, or doing anything bruise-inducing has never left more than those orange bruises that fade to green and go away in like 4 days or so. But this bruise was immediately bright purple and blue, and it hurt so bad to even touch, and took a good 2+ weeks to go away. Like, there's just no way that I wouldn't have felt it in my sleep. I mean, it was huge. Anyway, sometime after that, I can't exactly remember when, but I was trying to sleep, and whatever it was would not stay still, and I was getting really annoyed, so I said something like, "Yeah, alright buddy, I'm gonna need you to sit down or leave, cause I wanna sleep," and to my surprise, it actually stopped for a second. But then, I will never forget this as long as I live, there was a loud growl directly in my ear. For some reason I wasn't scared, so I just sort of laughed at it, and went to sleep. I'm not entirely sure why I reacted like that too. I know it sounds weird, but maybe it was the sleep delirium, maybe I was just sick of it at this point. I'm not exactly sure, but it's what I did. Other than the aggressive nightly walking around my bed, the most recent thing was a couple of months ago, where I was sleeping, but I woke up and couldn't open my eyes or even move. It felt like whatever it was, in its human form, if that's what you call it, was pinning me down to my bed. After a few seconds of trying to violently move my body, I finally moved and could open my eyes, so that was fun. I have so many other stories too, but they're all more just of the haha today this happened type. Perhaps I'll share more in the future, but this is an ongoing thing, so I don't know what else is going to happen. But yeah, if anyone has any idea of what this could be, or knows how this thing works, then please let me know, because although it freaks me out, I feel like if it really wanted to hurt me, it probably would have done it by now, right? So this is a bit of a short one, but it did freak me out at the time, and pretty much still to this day, and I thought that it would be good to share and see what you guys think. So it was a few years ago, I was home alone, at night in my bedroom, I was just chilling on my bed, and I started to sing. It's a thing that I do quite frequently, and as it was summer, I let the door of my balcony wide open to let the fresh air in. Then for some reason, I heard some weird noises coming from outside, like as if someone walked into the garden. I wasn't sure at immediate time if it was my cat, or my parents, or simply coming home, until I turned my head to the balcony door, and I saw a pair of hands of some guy trying to climb my balcony. I panicked after seeing it, and yelled, "Is there someone there?" Then the guy fell off, and went like, "Oh sorry, it's just me and my friends heard you singing, and we thought that you were in danger, so I decided to check if everything was okay, before just quickly taking off." I still don't know who that was. Maybe since the house next to ours was used as a vacation lodging, the guy and his friends probably just booked the house for a few days. But I'm not really sure, and still, if he was truly worried, then why did he try to climb my balcony, instead of simply knocking on the front door, or even calling the police or something? I don't know, the whole thing seemed very fishy, and when I think about it, it still gives me chills. My ex-girlfriend and I were playing video games late one night at her father's house, when she decided that she wanted to go home. We were neighbors living in the country, and our homes were well within walking distance of each other, and I noticed the time was 3 in the morning, so I continued playing a few matches with her brother before I too decided that it was time to go home. At 3:30, I walked outside to pure darkness. The moon and the stars were missing, so it was a really dark night. I couldn't see a thing, and noted that the many dogs that usually greet me before I leave just were not there like normal. The silence was odd, I have to admit. I assumed that they must have followed my ex home. I waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness before I left, but after what felt like 10 minutes, I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I know the trail back well enough to walk it blind, so I did just that. There is a bush between her father's home and ours, and as I entered, I started to get this feeling of dread. All my senses were warning me of something that I couldn't see. My anxiety was beginning to rise, but I steeled myself against my paranoia and kept going. Once I was out of the bush, I saw the outside light shining in the distance, and about halfway down the trail, I heard this tremendous crashing sound directly from behind me. The sounds of snapping branches and rustling weeds with the rumble of legs beating the ground. I turned around, thinking the dogs were coming to escort me home, but boy, I was wrong. This thing was definitely no dog. Time seemed to slow as I realized that this was nothing that I've ever seen before in my life. In fact, I still question if I actually saw anything. Maybe it was just in my head, but it was blacker than the night, a void in the shape of some sort of humanoid creature with a feline head. It's difficult to describe the absence of light having definition, but its black skin was stretched out over a sort of skeletal body. I'm a fairly tall guy too, and this thing's back looked like it was the height of my torso, but the shock of the encounter startled me into making a pathetic noise that makes me feel emasculated even thinking about it. But I quickly went into fight or flight, and I decided to fight this thing. I stomped my foot in a display of aggression, and put my hands ready to hit this thing. It stopped 10 or so feet in front of me, and that's when I noticed that it had hands. At mid-stride, it paused, and I saw it had black, long, slender fingers. For a moment, it just sort of seemed to stare at me, turned, and then ran back to where it came from without making a sound. One thing that I do remember is that it didn't have any tail, and I'll always remember just how graceful this thing looked running the other direction. Its movements were just so fluid. My adrenaline was peaked though at this point, and I was making these deep, powerful breaths as I walked back inside. But when I locked the door, I had this sensation wash over me, telling me that locking the door was a useless gesture. I had the sudden feeling that reality was porous, and that safety was, well, just an illusion. I eventually spoke with people about what I saw, and I'm told that apparently it was a water spirit. Elders in the area told me that it's been their well before their parents first warned them of its presence. I'm told it's powerful and can be summoned by people who use bad medicine, and one day I gathered my courage and did a search of the bush. I found a swamp in the center of it. I never even knew it was there in all my years of living in that area too. I love the night, but that encounter has me think twice before I go outside alone. If I do, I always bring a hunting knife with me, but I don't know if that will be of any help against something like that. Nevertheless, I guess I find comfort in my willingness to fight back if it ever did attack me again. However, I don't know if it intended on harming me, or maybe it was sending me a message. I still can't explain where that claim of reality being porous came from, but that's just what it felt like. Again, I don't know if I actually saw this thing, or maybe I was just hallucinating or something. Maybe it was lack of sleep. I don't know, but I'll never forget just how scared I was that night. I live in a really small house in the southern US, and I've lived here for about 5, maybe 6 months, and my house is considered a mother-in-law house on my landlord's property. So it's really just a small downstairs and small upstairs, but it works well for me since I don't have many things. The little house itself has been on the landlord's property for about 80 years now. It was actually shipped here from out of state, and the owners at the time re-cemented it into the ground. I've never had any issue in the house, or suspicious or unexplained things go on. However, I've never felt entirely comfortable on the second floor of the house either for some reason, because I just regularly get the feeling that I'm being watched or that there's another presence in the room or something. It's not a feeling that I would previously get in other homes that I've lived in, but it's almost atmospheric if that's the right way to explain it. I find it a little bit unsettling and can ignore it most of the time, but last night as I got into bed and pulled the blankets over me, I turned my head to the side to sleep, and I swear to you that I felt pressure being applied to the blanket that was near my head. It only lasted about 2 seconds, but it was gentle, and I felt it move across a few inches down from my head. At first I assumed that it's my cat walking over to me, so I turned to look for her, and when I do, there's nothing there. In the moment, I just ignored it, and I turned my lights off. It did cross my mind as a little bit strange, and I went on to wake up several times throughout the night though. This was somewhat normal for me though. I also noticed that my bathroom motion sensor light was turning on multiple times throughout the night when I was up, which I must admit did make me feel uneasy. And when I woke up for work this morning, it just kind of struck me that it almost felt like a finger slowly moving from my head to my neck. There's a part of me that sees all of this as just kind of happenstance, but I can't repress the uncomfortable feeling I get upstairs any longer, and the little things happening last night weren't quite adding up. I'm also feeling even more uncomfortable about going up there to sleep tonight, so wish me luck I guess. When I was around 10, I used to live with my mom, but my parents were divorced, in a house for people with low incomes. The primary floor is where you found the common places like the living room or the kitchen, and the second floor is only made of 2 bedrooms, a toilet, and the bathroom. There's not much space on that second floor, so you can easily see or hear anything in the toilet or the bathroom from my bedroom. Well, at the time, I was sad about my parents getting divorced, so in order to help me sleep easily, my mother used to set a light on upstairs and a bit of music on a computer, and this really helped for maybe a year or so, until it happened. So one night, as usual, I was going to bed. I don't know how to describe it best, but it was one of those beds that had a bookshelf and a desk under it, so it was quite close to the ceiling. The music and the light were on, and everything was fine until the music stopped. My mother was downstairs with a friend of hers, so she couldn't hear that the music was off. But it was okay. I wasn't afraid. This had happened a few times before. But then I started to hear like someone slowly walking close to the door of my bedroom, which was almost closed in order to let some light in. The floor of this place is like plastic. It can make this like a little sticky noise when you walk on it with your bare feet, and that was the sound that I heard. I could also hear my mom downstairs, so I was sure that she wasn't the one walking around here, and it continued for quite some time, and then it started to make that sound in my bedroom, right under my bed, like someone was just walking in my room and under my bed. I began to be really scared, so I tried to hide under my blanket. I could move, but I couldn't scream or make a damn noise. And finally I started to feel little vibrations inside the bed, with the noise that something was taking the stair of my bed. At that moment I turned my back. I didn't want to see it. All I could hear was the noise of the stairs and the feeling that something heavy was standing right by my side. It ended when I felt a sort of cold whoosh from the back of my head, strong enough to go under the blanket again. I screamed so loud that my mom thought that I had a heart attack or something. She took care of me all night and told me later, years later, that when she came into the bedroom she felt really uncomfortable in there because the room was ice cold. Since then I've had multiple experiences on the second floor of this house. I still live in it actually. There's some scary and others just really weird. If you guys would like to hear more about this house, or if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section below. I'm a female, 23 years old as of today, but this happened a couple of years ago. I was 19 at the time. So before I tell this story, I guess you're going to need a little bit of context. At the time I was in my second semester at university, so most of my classes were scheduled very early in the morning. Here in my country, there's not on-campus housing or anything like that, so I had to come and go from my house to uni and vice versa. As someone who happens to use a wheelchair, finding transport was extremely difficult for me. Having that in mind meant that taking a taxi where I live isn't the safest option. I've always had one particular taxi driver who moved me wherever I needed to go. Every day he would come and pick me up from my classes, always on time, every day except that morning. 6:45 a.m., and there were no signs of him. My first class was at 7 a.m., and I had to go, or I wouldn't get there in time. Afraid that my grades would be affected by skipping that one class, and also against my better judgment, I decided to take a regular cab, which wasn't easy because not that many of them would stop after seeing the wheelchair. Not enough space, they said, and I would always sigh waiting for the next one. But then one of them finally accepted to take me, and it must have been the fact that I was running late or how poor lit it was at the time. But I just gave him one glance before climbing in the car. He helped me to put my chair into the back seat before sitting in the driver's side of the car. That's when I could see him better, and yeah, he was a little ragged and a bit sketchy. His face was dirty and had multiple pimples and marks. But then again I thought, who am I to judge? It's just a 15-minute drive and I'm already inside, so I smiled and tried to be polite, keeping my eyes up front. He seemed to be chatty, asking all kinds of questions, to which I only answered short and simple, nodding and not wanting to be rude. After a while, I just stopped answering because it was getting a little bit weird. Instead, he started telling me about his life, how he'd separated from his wife because he found her with another man, and how he wanted to kill them both. More specifically, all the ways of how he was going to kill them as well. I was feeling freaked out by the way that he was telling me those things. His voice was just so full of rage, and his face turned so red. But the look on his face, I'll never forget it. Those were the eyes of a true madman. At this point, my hand was glued to the door handle. He just kept getting angrier and angrier, and I wanted, actively considered even, to throw myself out of the car. Obviously I couldn't though. He then said in a quiet, lower voice, "I've done some horrible things, miss." And I just tried to keep calm for just a few more minutes, I thought. I don't remember much more of what he told me before we got to the parking lot of my uni. Except this, miss, the devil is inside of me. Needless to say, it was a very scary ride. When he helped me out of the car, he also told me, "Be good or I could kill you someday." I didn't say anything, just paid him, and then I rolled away. After 5 minutes, I could see him from the central hallway, still in the parking lot. He wouldn't leave, and I had to do at least 3 laps in the main building until he was gone. I didn't want him to know where my classroom was, and even after he left, I called a friend to escort me to the class just in case. In the end, too, I was unfortunately 30 minutes late for class, but I've never been that scared, and I hope I won't ever be again. My father Wayne worked in a machine shop across town which had its fair share of characters there, and one of these people was James. Now, James was one of those guys that would seem normal at first, but had one hell of a temper. One minute he'd be eating lunch, and the next he'd be trying to fight you over the smallest things. Now, while my father was at work, James had come in absolutely drunk, which many other guys had done before, but James could barely function, let alone operate a mill. My father pulled him aside and told him that he needs to leave, that him coming in drunk could possibly get him, or someone else hurt, which leads to him getting pissed and trying to fight my dad. James isn't a small guy too. He's 6 foot and on the larger side, while my father is only 5 feet 6 inches. James grabbed a metal pole too, and was swinging it around trying to hit my dad. Thankfully he didn't hit him, but tore the hell out of the door before being restrained by the other workers, and was kicked out, being fired. My father ended up leaving work early that day, and made his way to a friend, and they had a beer and just calmed his nerves. And later on in the day, 8-year-old me was home alone as my mother was at the store getting groceries. I was playing Halo 3 at the time before hearing a knock at the door, and I walked up to the door and see James through the window. Although I didn't know him, well, as I've only met him once, I knew him well enough to know that he wasn't a stranger, so I opened the door. "Hey, is your father home?" He had said in the nicest tone that I guess he could muster, his breath smelling of alcohol. I said no, but somehow my 8-year-old self knew well enough to not say that I was home alone. My mum is in the shower though. That was an absolute lie. Her truck wasn't even in the driveway, and it was obvious that I was home alone. He had nodded, though, walking away from the door a little before I closed it, promptly locking it before going back to my game. A few minutes pass, and my mother arrives home with a few groceries. Once they were brought inside, we had heard a bang at the door, then another and another, and this was not like a knock, but more like someone was banging on our door trying to get in. My mother looked through the window before grabbing me and the phone and running into the bedroom closet, which had a lock. I had no clue what was going on, but I knew then that it wasn't good. She called 911 and said that there was a crazed man trying to break in. All the while the sound of the banging could be heard in the background. For what seemed like hours we waited in the closet, still hearing the loud bangs as he started charging into the door with his shoulder, screaming like a maniac. After about 15 minutes, we heard the familiar sound of the police siren as we heard the confrontation outside. It didn't take long for them to arrest the man. My mother stayed on the line with the 911 operator until we finally walked out, seeing James in cuffs in the back of the patrol car. My father had rushed home and hugged us both, James staring at us with bloodlust in his eyes, and although it wasn't confirmed, I had a good feeling that he was just after my dad, wanting to finish the job and beating him and potentially killing him. He had seen my mother's truck, thinking that it was my father as he drove it into work every now and again, but in the end it was a pretty narrow escape for my dad, I think. So this happened when I was 15 and out hunting with my father and one of his friends from work. His name was Frank, who was a lot more experienced with hunting than we were. It was an archery javelina hunt nearby to Crown King, if anyone's interested. So we got pretty lucky coming up on a squadron of javelina as we were driving out to our campsite, so we stalked them for a little bit, and Frank managed to get a shot on one, but lost it in the bush after following a blood trail for a few hours. After our failed attempt of searching, we made our way back to our designated campsite. We set up camp, and it was around 3 in the afternoon, so we decided to just call it a day at that point. That night I lay in my sleeping bag with my father, as Frank slept in a separate tent next to ours. It was a quiet night, which was to be expected since the deserts of Arizona are usually very quiet. When I woke up around what I would assume to be like 1 in the morning, hearing walking around our tent, figuring that it was maybe just a javelina or maybe even a deer, I just laid there listening and waiting for it to go away. But one sound absolutely broke the silence though, and scared the crap out of me, because clear as day right outside of our tent, you could hear a loud back, like someone saying the word back. It was aggressive, and it caught the attention of my father, who stayed quiet. The silence resumed again, and maybe like 40 seconds later, almost like a recording on a tape recorder, we heard it again. In different circumstances, we would have walked out to see what was going on, but everything was just way too quiet. There was no struggle like a guy fighting a man or an animal, just this person yelling back. This continued for maybe another 5 minutes with him occasionally yelling again, but soon the yells got quieter and we knew the man had walked away. I didn't sleep at all the rest of the night and just kind of laid there in silence looking at the zipper to our sleeping bag half expecting someone to start to unzip it. Thankfully that never happened, but it had been an hour before someone finally broke the silence. It was my dad, and he said, "What the fuck?" We didn't leave the tent, so we could clearly see the sun in the sky before we heard Frank exit his tent, before saying the coast was clear. Him obviously being awake from the whole incident too, and he looked just as shaken up as we were. We started a fire, and my father drank some coffee, and we just stood there in silence, still trying to comprehend what we had just heard a few hours ago. Frank had finally piped up about it, and he said, "Well guys, I think I saw it." The thing had to be at least 7 feet tall. Unlike our tent, Frank's tent was more for summer and made for a better bug net than a tent. You could clearly see at the top too, since it was nothing more than a visor, and that was how we saw it. After a little bit of thinking, we decided to end our hunt, there seeing how I was pretty shaken up by this, and I didn't really feel comfortable about being out there. A few years had passed, and I'm 18 at this point, and my family and Frank had gotten together to talk and just hang out, and it was at this point that he told me something that he hadn't said on the trip, trying not to scare me that day. He said that when he saw it, its face was just pale white like computer paper white, and it was at least 7 or possibly 8 feet tall.